Welcome to a calm journey through the hidden history of North Korea. From war and famine to dynasties, nuclear ambition, propaganda, and survival, this story explores how one of the world's most secretive nations endures. Discover the contradictions of fear and loyalty, isolation and pride, and the enduring mystery of a country both fragile and unshakable. The Korean peninsula is a stretch of land jutting between China, Russia, and Japan, a bridge between empires and cultures, a place where geography has always dictated destiny. For thousands of years, Korea was one people, one language, one continuous thread of history, often caught between the ambitions of larger neighbors, but always maintaining its identity. Yet, in the 20th century, that thread was torn in two. The division of Korea after World War II remains one of the most dramatic examples of how global politics can split a nation not along its own will, but along the chalk lines of foreign powers. To understand the story of North Korea, one must begin here, with the partition of a single land into two countries, two ideologies, two futures. The roots of division go back to Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910. For 35 years, Korea lived under colonial rule, stripped of autonomy, its language suppressed, its resources exploited. The Japanese built railroads, mines, and industries, but the benefits flowed outward, enriching Tokyo rather than Seoul or Pyongyang. Resistance grew in pockets, from guerrilla fighters in the mountains to students on the streets, but the empire's grip was tight. By the time World War II erupted, Korea was deeply tied into Japan's war machine, providing soldiers, laborers, and supplies. Yet in secret, Korean nationalists dreamed of liberation, waiting for the empire to fall. That fall came in 1945, sudden and catastrophic. Japan's surrender after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended decades of colonial domination overnight. For Koreans, it was a moment of euphoria, a long-awaited freedom after generations of foreign rule. Crowds poured into the streets, waving makeshift flags, tearing down symbols of occupation, dreaming of a new future. But within weeks, the dream was complicated by global geopolitics. The United States and the Soviet Union, racing to establish influence in the post-war world, turned Korea into one of the first front lines of the Cold War. In August 1945, with Japan's surrender imminent, American planners quickly realized they needed a way to manage Korea. With little preparation, officials in Washington hastily proposed dividing the peninsula along the 38th parallel, a line chosen not by Korean voices, but by a map on a desk. The Soviets, who had already entered Korea from the north, agreed. In theory, the division was temporary, merely a practical measure to accept Japan's surrender and stabilize the region. In practice, it planted the seed of permanent division. The Soviets occupied the north, the Americans the south. A nation that had endured centuries of unity, even under foreign control, now found itself split in half, the division decided by outsiders with no knowledge of the land's history. The people of Korea did not vote on this line. They were not consulted. Families were divided overnight, villages cut in two, trade routes severed. What had been one community became two, not because of cultural or linguistic differences, but because two superpowers drew a line on a map. This artificial border would harden into one of the most militarized frontiers on Earth. But in 1945, it was still porous, still fluid. Koreans crossed it freely, uncertain of what the future held. Some saw the Soviets as liberators, others saw the Americans as saviors. Most simply longed for unity, unaware of how quickly the line would solidify into division. In the north, the Soviet Union moved swiftly to establish control. They supported local communists, including a young guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung, who had battled the Japanese in Manchuria. With Soviet backing, Kim rose to prominence, becoming the face of the new order. Land reform was introduced, redistributing estates from landlords to peasants, winning support among the poor. Factories and infrastructure left by the Japanese were nationalized, tied into the socialist model. The Soviets built a political system that mirrored their own, ensuring loyalty to Moscow while fostering a strong nationalist image. The North began to transform into a socialist state, its identity shaped by revolution and resistance. In the South, the Americans faced their own challenges. They inherited a population hungry for independence, but fractured by ideological divisions. Conservatives, nationalists, and leftists vied for power, each with their own vision of Korea's future. The Americans installed Syngman Rhee, an ardent anti-communist who had spent decades in exile in the United States, as the leader of the emerging southern state. Rhee promised stability and resisted communist influence, but his rule quickly became authoritarian. In both halves of the peninsula, democracy was promised but not delivered. Instead, two competing regimes took shape, each claiming to represent the true Korea. The line at the 38th parallel hardened quickly. By 1947, tensions between the Soviets and Americans made cooperation impossible. Plans for a unified Korea collapsed as each side entrenched its own system. In 1948, the Republic of Korea was formally established in the south, followed by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north. Two governments, two armies, two flags, and two competing claims to legitimacy were born. Each declared itself the sole rightful ruler of all Korea. Unity, once assumed, now seemed out of reach. For ordinary Koreans, the division was devastating. Families separated by the line had no way to reunite. Letters could not cross. Phone calls were impossible. A brother might be in the north, a sister in the south, and they would never meet again. Trade between regions collapsed, leaving shortages. Cultural ties frayed as propaganda from both sides painted the other as an enemy. Within just a few years, what had been one people was taught to see itself as two. Subjectively, this felt like waking from one nightmare of colonialism only to enter another. A prison built not by Japan, but by the superpowers of the New World Order. The division of Korea also reflected broader currents of global politics. The Cold War was not yet named, but its dynamics were clear. The United States and the Soviet Union were carving spheres of influence, using ideology as justification. In Europe, Germany was divided into East and West. In Asia, Korea became another front line. What made Korea unique was its homogeneity. Unlike Germany, which had deep regional and cultural differences, Korea had been unified for centuries. The split was not natural but imposed, making it all the more painful and artificial. This explains why the conflict over Korea escalated so fiercely in the following years. The division was not accepted but resisted by both sides. By the end of the 1940s, the peninsula had become a powder keg. Both North and South built armies, both declared the other illegitimate, and both dreamed of reunification by force if necessary. The division was supposed to be temporary, but by then it was entrenched. The Korean War, which would erupt in 1950, was not only a battle between two regimes, but a tragic attempt to undo the artificial partition. The war would devastate the land, kill millions, and cement the division permanently. But in 1945, in the moment of liberation, few could have predicted that the joy of independence would so quickly transform into the sorrow of separation. The story of a land divided is the foundation of the story of North Korea. Without understanding how the peninsula was split, one cannot grasp why North Korea exists at all. It is a country born not from natural borders or ancient divisions, but from the decisions of superpowers far away, decisions made in haste, decisions that ignored the will of the people who lived there. The 38th parallel was a line drawn on a map, but it became a scar across generations, shaping politics, families, and identity for decades to come. Sex feels good, life feels fleeting, history feels long. But the division of Korea is one of those moments where human decisions outlast the people who made them. Today, the demilitarized zone that runs across the peninsula is one of the most fortified borders on Earth, a symbol of Cold War tensions that never fully ended. But it began with a single choice in 1945, a hurried pencil line on a map, dividing a people who never asked to be divided. To understand North Korea is to return to that line, to the moment when liberation gave way to separation and unity gave way to division. The land was one, the people were one, but global politics tore it in two. That is the unspeakable beginning of the story that still shapes our world today. When the guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, Korea was free for the first time in a generation. Japanese rule had ended, the empire had collapsed, and on the surface it seemed like a new dawn. Yet freedom was not simple, nor was leadership clear. Into this vacuum stepped a man whose name would shape the lives of every North Korean for decades to come: Kim Il-sung. His rise to power was not inevitable, but it was carefully crafted, nurtured by Soviet influence, and wrapped in layers of ideology and myth that transformed him from guerrilla fighter into supreme leader. To understand the creation of North Korea, one must understand how Kim Il-sung became not just a political figure, but the embodiment of a regime. Kim Il-sung was not a mythical figure at the start. He was born Kim Song-ju in 1912, during the early years of Japanese colonization. His family, like many Koreans, lived under oppression, their land and livelihood strained by the empire's policies. As a young man, he became involved in resistance movements, joining guerrilla fighters in Manchuria, the rugged borderlands between Korea and China. There, he fought against Japanese forces, enduring the hardships of life in the mountains, surviving bitter winters, skirmishes, and constant retreat. These experiences forged his reputation as a fighter, though the scale of his battles was far smaller than later stories would claim. Still, in a time when Korea longed for heroes, his role as a guerrilla gave him credibility as a man who had resisted when others could not. The Soviet Union, emerging victorious against Japan in the final days of the war, recognized Kim's potential. They needed a loyal figure to lead the northern zone of occupied Korea, someone who could unite the people under socialism while staying firmly aligned with Moscow. Kim fit the role. He was young, he spoke Russian, and most importantly, he owed his future to Soviet support. In 1945, he returned to Pyongyang with Soviet backing, and within a few years, he was firmly installed as the premier of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. His rise was not just about personal ambition, it was about geopolitics. The Soviets wanted a puppet, but Kim became something more. A master of myth, a leader who turned foreign sponsorship into the appearance of national legitimacy. From the beginning, Kim Il-sung blended ideology with nationalism. Communism alone was not enough to win over the Korean people, many of whom had little familiarity with Marxist doctrine. Instead, Kim framed his leadership as part of Korea's long struggle for independence. He positioned himself as the liberator, the one who had fought bravely in the mountains while others collaborated. State propaganda inflated his exploits, rewriting history to make him the central figure of resistance. Battles that had been small skirmishes were retold as decisive victories. His role as a guerrilla leader was magnified until it filled every corner of the story. Through newspapers, speeches, and posters, Kim became more than a man. He became the symbol of a free and self-reliant Korea, even though his power depended heavily on Soviet protection. At the same time, Kim Il-sung introduced the ideology that would define North Korea for generations: Juche, the philosophy of self-reliance. While still drawing heavily from Soviet and Chinese communism, Juche was presented as uniquely Korean. It was not Marx's theory or Lenin's revolution transplanted from abroad, but a doctrine rooted in national pride, designed to resonate with a people weary of foreign domination. Juche proclaimed that Korea must depend on itself, chart its own course, and resist outside control. The irony, of course, was that the state preaching self-reliance was being built with Soviet troops and Soviet advisors. Yet the message worked. It gave people a sense of dignity after decades of colonization. It gave Kim a foundation for his rule that was both ideological and emotional. The cult of personality grew rapidly around him. Unlike other communist leaders, whose images were important but not divine, Kim's image became omnipresent. His portrait hung in every home. His speeches were memorized like scripture. His name invoked with reverence. The state created rituals around his life, stories of his childhood bravery, tales of his guerrilla exploits, anecdotes of his wisdom. Children learned songs praising him before they could read. Citizens were required to bow to his statues, attend endless sessions of ideological study, and participate in mass rallies that celebrated his leadership. Over time, the distinction between Kim Il-sung the man and Kim Il-sung the myth disappeared. He was no longer just a leader. He was the embodiment of the nation itself. This transformation was carefully orchestrated. The Workers' Party of Korea, under Kim's control, eliminated rivals one by one. Early leaders who had also fought the Japanese, or who had strong ties to Moscow or Beijing, were sidelined, purged, or executed. Within a decade, Kim had consolidated absolute power, ensuring that no one could challenge his authority. The state became a family project, with loyalty to Kim treated as loyalty to the country. Opposition was not only silenced, but erased from history. Textbooks omitted alternative figures, newspapers printed only praise, and memory itself was reshaped. By the 1950s, Kim Il-sung was not just the leader of North Korea. He was North Korea. For ordinary people, life under the new regime was a mix of hope and hardship. Land reform redistributed property, breaking up the estates of landlords and giving plots to peasants. For many poor families, this was a moment of empowerment, a sense that the state was working for them. At the same time, heavy industry was nationalized, labor was mobilized, and a command economy took shape. The system promised equality, but demanded obedience. Citizens received education and healthcare, but they also entered a world where surveillance was constant, where deviation from the party line could mean imprisonment or worse. The cult of Kim Il-sung was not just symbolic. It was enforced through every layer of society, from neighborhood watch units to schools to workplaces. The myth of Kim as a father figure became central to the regime's narrative. He was portrayed not only as a political leader, but as the protector of the people, the benevolent guide who would shield Korea from enemies and hardship. State media depicted him visiting factories, inspecting farms, listening to workers. These images were carefully staged, but they reinforced the idea that he was close to the people, a leader who cared for every detail of their lives. The paternal image was powerful, especially in a country that had endured colonial exploitation and war. To see the leader as a father gave citizens a sense of security, even as that security came with strict control. The birth of the regime was also the birth of a dynasty. While communist states like the Soviet Union or China maintained strong central figures, they did not pass power through family lines. Kim Il-sung changed that. From early on, his family was elevated, their names and stories woven into the national narrative. His son, Kim Jong-il, would later inherit this system, proving that the regime was not just political, but dynastic. The blending of monarchy and communism was unusual, but in Korea it became the foundation of stability. The leader was not just chosen, he was destined. The myth ensured continuity, making the regime less vulnerable to collapse when leaders aged or died. Internationally, Kim Il-sung presented himself as both a communist ally and a nationalist icon. To Moscow and Beijing, he was a useful partner, loyal enough to socialism, but independent enough to assert Korean pride. To his own people, he was the bulwark against imperialism, the man who would ensure Korea was never again dominated by outsiders. This dual image allowed him to navigate the dangerous currents of the Cold War, balancing between superpowers while maintaining his own authority. It also deepened the myth at home. Not only was Kim a hero of the past, he was the protector of the future. The birth of the regime was marked by both promise and tragedy. For many North Koreans, the early years of Kim's rule brought real improvements: land, literacy, healthcare, a sense of unity after decades of division. But these gains were tied to absolute loyalty, enforced through surveillance, propaganda, and purges. The cult of Kim Il-sung promised protection, but demanded submission. Over time, the balance tipped more toward control than care. But in the beginning, the myth was powerful enough to inspire hope. Looking back, it is striking how quickly Kim Il-sung transformed from guerrilla fighter to godlike leader. In less than a decade, he went from being one man among many in the resistance to being the undisputed ruler of a new state. This transformation was not accidental. It was the result of Soviet sponsorship, careful propaganda, ruthless elimination of rivals, and the creation of an ideology that merged nationalism with socialism. The result was a regime unlike any other, a communist monarchy built on myth, sustained by fear, and destined to endure long after its founder was gone. The birth of the North Korean regime was not the birth of freedom. It was the creation of a system that promised dignity but demanded obedience, that spoke of self-reliance while relying on myth, that offered unity while enforcing conformity. It was the moment when one man became more than a man, when Kim Il-sung became the face of a nation, when the line between leader and country blurred until it disappeared. That is the story of how North Korea began, not simply with borders and politics, but with the crafting of a regime that made one leader eternal. The Korean Peninsula in 1950 was a land heavy with tension, a scarred country barely 5 years removed from Japanese colonial rule and already split in half by rival governments. North and South Korea, born from the hurried decisions of superpowers after World War II, were more than just neighbors with different systems. They were mirror images locked in hostility, each claiming to be the one true Korea. In the North, Kim Il-sung spoke of reunification under socialism. In the South, Syngman Rhee vowed to crush communism and defend the Republic. Both sides insisted they represented the Korean people. Both built armies. Both dreamed of victory. It was only a matter of time before the fragile line drawn at the 38th parallel erupted into fire. The Korean War began in the early hours of June 25, 1950. Under cover of darkness, North Korean forces surged across the border, spearheaded by tanks supplied by the Soviet Union. For many in the south, the attack was sudden, overwhelming, and terrifying. Villages woke to the roar of artillery, cities to columns of armored vehicles rolling southward. The North Korean People's Army advanced rapidly, sweeping aside the lightly armed South Korean defenses. Within 3 days, they had captured Seoul, the capital. Refugees clogged the roads, carrying bundles of belongings, children, and fear. In the space of weeks, the dream of unity through politics was consumed by war. The initial victories of the North were decisive. Kim Il-sung believed his forces would reunify the peninsula in a matter of weeks, delivering a swift triumph that would cement his regime. The Soviet Union had quietly supported the plan, calculating that the United States might not respond decisively to a conflict in a small Asian country. For a time, it seemed they were right. But the invasion triggered an international response that would transform the Korean War into a global confrontation. The United Nations, led by the United States, condemned the attack and called for collective action. American troops, already stationed in Japan, were quickly mobilized and sent to Korea. Other nations, including Britain, Canada, Australia, and Turkey, contributed soldiers, making the Korean War one of the first major tests of the UN's ability to enforce peace. The conflict was no longer a civil war between North and South. It had become a battlefield in the Cold War, a place where the rivalry between communism and capitalism would be fought with guns, bombs, and blood. The early months of the war were brutal. South Korean forces, poorly equipped and undertrained, retreated steadily under the northern advance. By August 1950, almost the entire peninsula was under North Korean control, with the last line of defense at the Pusan perimeter, a small corner in the southeast. Here, UN and South Korean forces dug in, holding back wave after wave of assaults. Supplies and reinforcements poured in from the United States, stabilizing the front. For soldiers on both sides, the heat of summer, the stench of death, and the fear of annihilation became daily reality. For civilians, the war brought terror. Families torn apart, executions of suspected collaborators, and a refugee crisis of staggering proportions. In September, the course of the war shifted dramatically. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of UN forces, launched a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, a port near Seoul. The operation, considered risky due to treacherous tides, proved a stunning success. North Korean forces, overextended and unprepared, were cut off from their supply lines. Within weeks, Seoul was recaptured, and UN troops surged north, crossing the 38th parallel and driving toward the Yalu River, the border with China. For the first time, it seemed that the South, with international backing, might achieve reunification on its own terms. But the advance into the north triggered another shift. China, alarmed by the prospect of a pro-Western state on its border, intervened with massive force. In October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, the People's Volunteer Army, crossed into Korea. Moving under cover of night, they launched surprise attacks that pushed UN forces into retreat. The bitter Korean winter compounded the misery. At the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, American Marines fought in temperatures so cold that weapons jammed and flesh froze. They managed a fighting withdrawal, but the tide of the war had turned again. Seoul fell to Communist forces in January 1951, only to be recaptured by UN forces 2 months later. The war had settled into a grinding stalemate. For the next 2 years, the front lines shifted little, running roughly along the 38th parallel where the war had begun. Trenches scarred the hills, artillery pounded villages, and airstrikes devastated infrastructure. Civilians bore the worst of it. Cities were flattened, farmland destroyed, families scattered. An estimated 3 million Koreans, both civilian and military, died in the conflict, along with tens of thousands of Chinese and UN soldiers. The scale of suffering rivaled that of the Second World War, yet it unfolded in a country many in the outside world had barely known existed a decade earlier. Peace talks began as early as July 1951, but they dragged on for 2 years while the fighting continued. The main sticking points were the fate of prisoners of war and the exact location of the boundary between North and South. While negotiators debated, soldiers and civilians endured daily violence. Entire generations grew up amid hunger, bombings, and fear. For many Koreans, the war was not only a military conflict, but a civil tragedy, a fratricidal struggle in which brother fought brother, and families were permanently torn apart. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom. The agreement ended active combat, but did not establish peace. Instead, it froze the conflict where it stood, leaving the Korean peninsula divided almost exactly along the same line as before, the 38th parallel, now fortified into the demilitarized zone. No peace treaty was ever signed, meaning the war has technically never ended. For Koreans, the dream of reunification was buried under barbed wire, minefields, and watchtowers. The Korean War left legacies that endure to this day. In the north, Kim Il-sung emerged not as a failed aggressor, but as a hardened leader who had stood against the combined might of the West. The war allowed him to further consolidate power, building the myth of a country that had resisted invasion from both Japanese and American imperialists. The devastation of the conflict justified the militarization of society, the strict surveillance, and the cult of personality that defined his regime. In the south, Syngman Rhee also tightened his grip, using the war as proof of communist treachery and his own necessity. Democracy was stifled, dissent crushed, and the Cold War ensured continued American support. For the Korean people, the war was a wound that never fully healed. Families separated by the conflict remained divided by the sealed border. Letters could not be exchanged, visits were impossible, and generations grew up knowing they had relatives just a few miles away whom they would never meet. The scars of destruction reshaped cities, villages, and landscapes. Entire communities disappeared, erased by bombs or rebuilt in new forms. The trauma became intergenerational, passed down through stories of loss and longing. Internationally, the Korean War set the tone for decades of Cold War conflict. It was the first major confrontation where the United States and its allies fought directly against communist forces supported by the Soviet Union and China. It established the precedent of proxy wars, where superpowers battled through smaller nations without declaring global war. It also underscored the brutality of modern conflict, where civilians bore the brunt of suffering. For many outside observers, Korea was no longer a distant peninsula, but a symbol of the world's division. The Korean War ignited more than just battles. It ignited the permanent division of a people. Before 1950, the 38th parallel was a line on a map. After 1953, it became one of the most heavily fortified borders in human history. What was meant to be temporary became permanent, a scar carved into the land and psyche of Korea. The war did not resolve the question of unity. Instead, it froze it, leaving both North and South Korea determined, suspicious, and trapped in a conflict that still shapes their identities. The tragedy of the Korean War lies not only in its destruction, but in its futility. After 3 years, millions of deaths, and untold suffering, the peninsula ended up almost exactly where it had begun, divided in two, locked in hostility, with no peace in sight. Yet within that futility, regimes found strength. Kim Il-sung used the war to build his mythology, to claim that he had defended the nation against overwhelming odds, to justify the sacrifices he demanded from his people. The war gave him the narrative he needed to entrench his regime, ensuring that the division of Korea would not just be geographical, but ideological and generational. Sex feels fleeting, politics feels endless, and history feels cruel. But the Korean War is a reminder that decisions made in the heat of ideology can freeze a nation's destiny for decades. The war ignited not only bombs and bullets, but a permanent division, a frontier where time itself seems to stand still. To this day, the armistice line holds, guarded by soldiers, watched by the world, haunted by the ghosts of millions. That is the true legacy of the war, the creation of two Koreas, locked forever by a conflict that began in fire and ended in uneasy silence. When the guns of the Korean War finally fell silent in 1953, the land was scarred, the people exhausted, and the hopes of reunification buried under rubble. Yet amid the devastation, one man emerged stronger than ever. Kim Il-sung, who had led the North into war and presided over both victory and loss, was not weakened by the outcome. Instead, he transformed the stalemate into triumph, using the war's destruction to justify absolute control. Out of a land divided and battered, Kim built not only a state, but something rare in the communist world, a dynasty. Unlike Lenin or Stalin, unlike Mao or Castro, Kim Il-sung's vision for North Korea extended beyond himself. He planted the roots of a hereditary system where leadership would pass from father to son, then onward again, as though the nation itself were a family and the Kim bloodline its eternal patriarch. The first step in this transformation was consolidating power. During the war, Kim had relied on support from both the Soviet Union and China, along with a diverse coalition of domestic communists, guerrilla fighters, intellectuals, Soviet-trained cadres, and Korean communists who had lived in China. Each group had its own networks and influence. Once the armistice was signed, Kim began dismantling these rival factions. The message was clear. There would be only one leader, one party, one voice. Rivals, who had once stood beside him, were quietly purged. Some were accused of plotting conspiracies, others of disloyalty or hidden ties to foreign powers. Many disappeared into prison camps or were executed, their names erased from official histories. By the late 1950s, Kim had eliminated nearly all potential challengers. The Workers' Party of Korea became his personal instrument, and the state itself began to revolve entirely around his image. The cult of personality deepened in these years. Portraits of Kim Il-sung adorned every home, classroom, and office. Statues rose in cities and villages, depicting him as both warrior and father. Songs praised his wisdom, textbooks retold his childhood as a tale of prodigious bravery, and newspapers celebrated his every decision as flawless. The war, though devastating, was recast as proof of his genius. He had stood against American imperialism and survived. He had defended the homeland. The suffering of the people was reinterpreted as noble sacrifice, endured under the guidance of their leader. In a land where nearly every family had lost someone, this narrative turned grief into loyalty, despair into devotion. Kim Il-sung was no longer just a head of state. He was a father to the nation, a figure whose authority could not be questioned. But Kim was not content to be remembered only in the present. He understood that true survival required creating a system that would outlast him. In most communist countries, leadership passed through the party, determined by internal struggles or ideological shifts. Kim envisioned something different. He began to prepare his family for power, weaving them into the fabric of the regime. His son, Kim Jong-il, was raised not only as his child, but as his heir. From a young age, Jong-il's education, public appearances and roles within the party were carefully managed to build the image of continuity. The idea was subtle at first, but over time it became unmistakable. The revolution was not just political, it was familial. The notion of hereditary succession in a communist state was unprecedented. Marxist ideology emphasized class struggle, not bloodlines. But Kim Il-sung fused communism with Confucian traditions of filial piety and respect for elders, traditions deeply rooted in Korean culture. In Confucian thought, the family is the foundation of society, and loyalty to the father is paramount. By presenting himself as the father of the nation, Kim tapped into these values, transforming political obedience into filial duty. The leader was not just obeyed, he was revered, as a child reveres a parent. This cultural dimension gave his regime durability that pure ideology could not achieve. Juche, the philosophy of self-reliance, further reinforced this system. Though it began as a slogan for independence from foreign influence, Juche evolved into a doctrine that placed Kim Il-sung at its center. The leader was portrayed as the embodiment of Juche, the one who guided the people towards self-reliance, the one whose wisdom made independence possible. To be loyal to Kim was to be loyal to Juche, to the revolution, to the nation itself. Over time, the lines blurred until they were indistinguishable. Kim was not just a man or a leader. He was the living representation of ideology, fatherhood, and destiny. The state's apparatus of control ensured this system took root. Neighborhood watch committees reported on citizens' loyalty. Schools indoctrinated children from the earliest years, teaching them to sing songs of praise and memorize the leader's biography. Factories and farms organized study sessions to analyze Kim's speeches, treating his words as scripture. Citizens were required to keep portraits of Kim in their homes, dusted daily and displayed prominently. Any lapse in devotion could be punished severely, from public shaming to imprisonment in labor camps. Fear reinforced loyalty, but over time, ritual and repetition turned fear into habit. To live in North Korea was to live inside the myth of Kim Il-sung, where every aspect of daily life reinforced his authority. By the 1960s, the hereditary nature of the regime was becoming clearer. Kim Jong-il began to assume roles within the party, managing propaganda and cultural production. He oversaw films, operas, and literature that glorified his father and subtly introduced his own presence. The arts became a tool for dynastic succession, creating a narrative in which leadership was not only political, but artistic, visionary, and familial. Citizens who grew up in this era absorbed the message. The revolution was eternal, and so too was the Kim family. Kim Il-sung also expanded the reach of the state's surveillance and punishment system. The network of political prison camps grew, designed not only to punish dissenters, but to instill fear in the broader population. In North Korea, punishment extended to families. If one person was accused of disloyalty, parents, children, and siblings could all be sent to camps. This system, known as guilt by association, ensured that loyalty was not just individual, but collective. No one could risk defiance without endangering their loved ones. This method of control reinforced the dynastic system by making obedience not only a political choice, but a matter of survival for entire families. Internationally, Kim Il-sung projected his regime as fiercely independent. Though reliant on Soviet and Chinese support, he maneuvered between the two powers, extracting aid while maintaining autonomy. This balancing act enhanced his image at home as a leader who could stand up to foreign giants. North Koreans were told they lived in a country that was poor in resources but rich in spirit, guided by a leader who ensured their survival in a hostile world. This narrative further legitimized the hereditary model. Only the Kim family, portrayed as uniquely wise and brave, could protect Korea from enemies on all sides. The creation of a dynasty also required rewriting history. Textbooks presented Kim Il-sung not only as a hero of the anti-Japanese struggle, but as the sole architect of Korea's liberation. Other resistance fighters were erased, their names forgotten. Even Soviet contributions were minimized, replaced with stories of Kim's brilliance. The past was reshaped so thoroughly that generations of North Koreans grew up believing that their leader had single-handedly defeated Japan, defended the nation against the United States, and guided them toward prosperity. This control of memory ensured that the Kim family's claim to power felt natural, inevitable, unquestionable. The dynasty's foundations were reinforced by ritual. National holidays celebrated Kim Il-sung's birthday, his wartime victories, his speeches. Parades filled Pyongyang with images of unity, precision, and loyalty. Citizens were mobilized into mass games, performing synchronized displays that illustrated the harmony of the nation under the leader's guidance. These rituals were more than spectacle. They were a form of education, training citizens to see themselves as part of a collective body moving under the command of one mind. The leader was the head, the people the limbs, and together they formed a single organism. In this vision, succession was not just political but biological. The body could only survive if the bloodline continued. For the people, this system created both pride and fear. Many felt genuine devotion to Kim Il-sung, especially in the years when Reconstruction brought improvements in education, healthcare, and industry compared to the South. Others obeyed out of necessity, knowing the consequences of defiance. Over time, the distinction blurred. Loyalty became ritual, ritual became belief, and belief became identity. To question the dynasty was not just dangerous, it was unthinkable. In such an environment, hereditary succession was not merely possible but natural, as though the nation itself could not exist without the Kim family. The emergence of a dynasty in North Korea was a political innovation as much as it was a cultural adaptation. It fused communism with Confucian tradition, modern propaganda with ancient values, fear with devotion. It was unlike any other system in the world, a monarchy dressed in socialist language, a dictatorship presented as family. Kim Il-sung achieved what few leaders ever could. He made himself eternal by ensuring his family would inherit not only power, but myth. By the time Kim Il-sung aged into the later decades of his rule, the succession plan was well established. Kim Jong-il was no longer just his son. He was the heir, already shaping the nation's cultural identity, already woven into the narrative of revolution. The dynasty had taken root. North Korea was no longer merely a communist state. It was a family state, one where the blood of the leader was treated as sacred, one where the future was bound to the lineage of Kim. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may reshape nations, but dynasties outlast generations. The emergence of the Kim dynasty ensured that North Korea would be bound not only by ideology or borders, but by blood. That is the story of how one man, out of the ruins of war, created a regime unlike any other, a system where the leader was father, the nation was family, and power was hereditary. This was not just the birth of a state, it was the birth of a dynasty, one that still defines the Korean peninsula to this day. When outsiders look at North Korea, they often see isolation, a closed border, a sealed society, a people cut off from the rest of the world. But inside the regime, isolation is not presented as weakness. It is celebrated as virtue. The philosophy that underpins this outlook is called huche, a word that translates roughly as self-reliance. More than a political slogan, huche became a creed, a guiding doctrine that shaped every aspect of North Korean life. It is the philosophy that justified turning away from allies, the mantra that demanded sacrifice from citizens, the lens through which the regime defined survival. To understand the soul of North Korea, one must understand juche. The origins of juche lie with Kim Il-sung, who introduced it as early as the 1950s. In its simplest form, it declared that the Korean people must depend on themselves, not on foreign powers, to determine their destiny. For a nation that had endured Japanese colonization, then seen itself divided by Soviet and American occupation, the appeal was obvious. Self-reliance promised dignity, independence, and control after generations of subjugation. In its early years, juche was not yet a fully developed ideology, but a theme repeated in Kim's speeches. Koreans should not trust outsiders to chart their path. Over time, however, this theme was elevated into doctrine, reshaped into a near-religious creed that fused nationalism, socialism, and the cult of the leader. Huche drew heavily on Korea's cultural traditions. In Confucian thought, loyalty to family and nation was paramount, and respect for hierarchy structured daily life. Huche extended this logic, declaring that the nation itself was a family, with Kim Il-sung as the father guiding his children. Self-reliance did not mean individual independence. It meant collective obedience, where the people relied on the leader as the embodiment of their will. This twist was crucial. Juche did not empower ordinary citizens to make their own choices. It demanded that they place total faith in the leader, who in turn claimed to embody the nation's independence. Subjectively, for citizens, juche felt like duty, an unending call to sacrifice, endure, and obey, all in the name of national survival. Economically, juche translated into autarky, the attempt to build an economy completely independent of foreign aid or trade. North Korea invested heavily in heavy industry, seeking to mine its own coal, smelt its own steel, and manufacture its own weapons. Farms were collectivized, with the promise that the nation could feed itself without relying on imports. For a time, especially in the 1960s, this strategy produced real growth. Factories expanded, literacy rates rose, and citizens were told they lived in a nation that stood tall without bending to outsiders. The slogan of self-reliance resonated deeply. But as years passed, the limits of isolation became clear. Natural resources were finite, technology lagged behind, and agricultural yields faltered. Still, the ideology insisted that turning outward was betrayal. Even as hunger grew, juche demanded loyalty to the idea of independence. Politically, juche provided justification for absolute control. By declaring self-reliance the highest virtue, the regime argued that foreign ideas were dangerous, that outside influences would corrupt the purity of the nation. This logic sealed borders, censored information, and punished dissent. Citizens were told that every hardship they endured, shortages, rationing, endless work, was noble sacrifice in the name of future. Propaganda presented images of cheerful workers building factories, soldiers standing tall on the frontier, farmers smiling in the fields. The message was simple. True Koreans endure together, relying on no one but themselves and their leader. This created a culture where endurance was celebrated and questioning was framed as betrayal. Culturally, Juche seeped into art, literature, and daily ritual. Novels and films depicted heroic workers who achieved greatness through self-reliance. Songs praised Kim Il-sung as the son of the nation, whose wisdom made Juche possible. Monuments were built to commemorate battles and sacrifices framed through the lens of independence. Even architecture carried the message, grand, imposing structures built to showcase the strength of a nation that claimed to need no help. In classrooms, children memorized not only the principles of socialism, but the teachings of Juche, reciting passages as though they were sacred texts. Daily life was a constant reminder that self-reliance was not just an idea, but an identity. The irony of Juche was that North Korea never truly stood alone. It received extensive aid from the Soviet Union and China, particularly during the Cold War. Industrial equipment, fuel, and food flowed across its borders. Without this support, the economy would have collapsed much sooner. Yet state propaganda denied or minimized this reality, insisting that the nation thrived through its own efforts. Juche was less about fact than about belief. It gave people a framework to explain their suffering, a reason to accept sacrifice, a story that transformed deprivation into honor. Subjectively, it meant that even in hunger, people were told they were strong, that even in hardship, they were noble. The philosophy of Juche became most visible during crisis. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea lost much of its external support. Floods and droughts struck, devastating crops. The country plunged into famine, known officially as the Arduous March. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, died of starvation. Yet even then, the regime invoked Juche, telling the people that endurance itself was victory. Citizens were urged to tighten their belts, to rely on wild grasses, tree bark, and sheer willpower. Starvation was reframed as sacrifice, survival as proof of loyalty. The philosophy of isolation became a shield against criticism, ensuring that even catastrophe could be spun as virtue. Internationally, Juche gave North Korea a unique posture. Unlike other communist states, which often framed themselves as part of a global revolution, North Korea insisted on uniqueness. It portrayed itself as a small but proud nation, surrounded by hostile giants, yet refusing to bend. This narrative won sympathy among some anti-imperialist movements around the world, who saw North Korea as a symbol of defiance. But for most nations, Juche became synonymous with isolation and secrecy, the creed of a state that cut itself off in order to preserve its rule. The image of the hermit kingdom was reinforced, even though Juche was more about pride than withdrawal. For citizens, Juche shaped not only politics, but psychology. It taught them to see hardship as natural, to expect little from the outside world, to define dignity through endurance rather than abundance. A family without electricity could still tell itself it was living nobly, resisting foreign corruption. A soldier standing guard at the border could believe his sacrifice kept the nation pure. A student reciting Kim Il-sung's words could feel part of a tradition of strength. Subjectively, Juche meant survival through meaning. Hardship endured not as failure, but as destiny. The hereditary nature of the regime fused seamlessly with Juche. Kim Il-sung was the founder, the embodiment of self-reliance. His son Kim Jong-il inherited not just power, but ideology, framing himself as the guardian of Juche. Later, Kim Jong-un would do the same, insisting that his leadership was the continuation of the same creed. In this way, Juche became not just a philosophy of isolation, but a philosophy of dynasty, where loyalty to the leader's bloodline was equated with loyalty to self-reliance itself. To reject one was to reject the other. The system reinforced itself, turning philosophy into permanence. Critics outside North Korea point to Juche as a tool of control, a doctrine that justified dictatorship and masked dependence on aid. Yet inside, its power lies not in logic, but in identity. For generations raised with Juche as daily truth, it is not simply a political idea. It is the story of who they are. It explains the past, rationalizes the present, and promises a future. Even as smuggled media and glimpses of the outside world show contradictions, the framework of Juche remains deeply ingrained. To abandon it would be to abandon not just a regime, but a sense of self. Juche is, in the end, the philosophy of survival through story. It took the raw fact of isolation, geographical, political, economic, and transformed it into virtue. It told a people that being cut off was strength, that hunger was sacrifice, that obedience was honor. It made the impossible seem noble and the unbearable seem meaningful. Sex may feel fleeting, war may shape borders, dynasties may rise and fall, but Juche turned isolation itself into permanence, giving North Korea not just a political system, but a creed that has endured for decades. It is the philosophy of a nation that insists on standing alone, even when the cost is unimaginable. To live in North Korea is to live under eyes that never close. From the moment a child is born, their life unfolds within a web of surveillance so thorough that privacy itself becomes unimaginable. Neighbors watch neighbors, co-workers report on one another, students inform on teachers, and even within families, silence becomes a kind of protection. The regime's machinery of control is not only about soldiers and police, but about an all-seeing system woven into daily existence, where every action is measured for loyalty and every word can echo with consequences. At the heart of this system are the Inminban, or neighborhood watch units. Every citizen belongs to one, usually composed of a few dozen households grouped together. These units are not voluntary organizations. They are mandatory extensions of the state into private life. Each Inminban is overseen by a leader, often a middle-aged woman chosen for her loyalty, who reports directly to local officials. Meetings are frequent, sometimes daily, where residents recite propaganda, confess shortcomings, and denounce suspicious behavior. Attendance is recorded, absences noted, and discussion centered not on civic participation, but on vigilance. To miss a meeting or fail to participate enthusiastically is to invite suspicion. To belong to an Inminban is to live inside a constant reminder that your life is not your own. The Ministry of State Security, North Korea's secret police, sits above this system like a shadow government. It is tasked with rooting out disloyalty, preventing dissent, and maintaining the cult of the Kim family. Its reach extends everywhere, from factories to schools, from villages to cities. Informants are placed in every workplace, every unit of the army, every organization. No one knows who might be listening. A careless remark about shortages, a joke about leadership, even a sigh of discontent can be reported, and punishment can fall not just on the speaker, but on their entire family. This principle of collective punishment ensures that fear binds people together. Parents teach their children to stay silent. Spouses guard their conversations. Friends weigh every word. Trust becomes dangerous. Silence becomes survival. The surveillance system is not only about words, it is about rituals of loyalty that must be performed constantly. Every home is required to display portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, later joined by Kim Jong-un. These portraits must be kept spotless, dusted daily, polished with care. Inspectors may arrive without warning to check their condition, and failure to maintain them properly can bring punishment. Citizens bow before statues of the leaders, attend rallies where they wave flags and chant slogans, and memorize speeches as though they were sacred scripture. Participation is not optional, and enthusiasm is measured. In such a system, surveillance is not merely external, it becomes internalized. People police themselves, adjusting their expressions, their posture, their tone, lest someone interpret hesitation as doubt. Technology, though limited in North Korea compared to much of the world, serves the surveillance state as well. Radios are fixed to receive only state channels, sealed so they cannot be tuned to foreign frequencies. Televisions carry only government broadcasts filled with propaganda. Phones are monitored, and only a small elite have access to the internet, which itself is restricted to a closed domestic network. For most citizens, contact with the outside world is impossible. Information is filtered, controlled, and framed so that the state's version of reality is the only one available. In this way, surveillance is not just about what people do, but about what they can know. By controlling information, the regime ensures that loyalty is not challenged by comparison, that discontent has no language in which to speak. The punishment for even perceived disloyalty is severe. Political prison camps, vast complexes hidden in valleys and mountains, hold tens of thousands of people. Entire families may be sent there for the crime of one member. Life in these camps is brutal, with forced labor, starvation, and violence. Few ever leave. The knowledge that such places exist, even if most citizens never see them directly, reinforces the power of surveillance. The possibility of vanishing into a camp is enough to keep people in line. Fear does not have to be constantly exercised when it is constantly remembered. Yet the system is not sustained by fear alone. It is also sustained by ritual, by constant reinforcement of ideology. Children are taught from their earliest years to report unusual behavior. School lessons include questions about whether parents have expressed gratitude to the leader. Workplace meetings require self-criticism sessions where individuals confess shortcomings and pledge to do better. These rituals bind surveillance into the fabric of life, making it less an intrusion and more a routine. Over time, the boundaries between genuine belief, forced performance, and survival blur. A child who reports a parent may not know whether they are betraying or protecting their family because loyalty to the state is framed as loyalty to life itself. The genius of North Korea's surveillance system lies in its invisibility. Cameras and guards play their part, but the true strength comes from uncertainty. No one knows who is listening, who is watching, who might report them. The neighbor who shares food today may be the informant tomorrow. The co-worker who smiles in the factory may be recording every word for the secret police. This uncertainty creates a society where everyone is cautious, where people perform loyalty not only in public but in private, where even thoughts are policed by fear of expression. The result is a population that appears unified, disciplined, and devoted, even if beneath the surface doubt and frustration simmer. Despite the suffocating control, cracks exist. Smuggled radios, hidden USB drives, and whispered conversations allow glimpses of the outside world. People learn that not all nations endure famine, that not every leader demands worship, that freedom exists beyond the border. Yet even these cracks are shaped by surveillance. Those caught with foreign media face harsh punishment. Families are questioned, interrogations conducted, trust tested. For many, the risk is too great, and so surveillance continues to hold sway. Even when citizens glimpse another reality, the machinery of control makes acting on it nearly impossible. The psychological effect of life under surveillance is profound. When every action is scrutinized, individuals learn to perform constantly. Smiles are practiced, cheers rehearsed, gratitude expressed loudly and often. Even in private, people may continue these performances because the line between sincerity and survival has blurred. Over time, some internalize the rituals, convincing themselves of their own loyalty. Others live in quiet duality, outwardly obedient but inwardly skeptical. But both paths are shaped by the same reality, a state that sees all, hears all, and punishes all who step outside its bounds. For outsiders, it is difficult to imagine life without privacy, without safe spaces, without trust. Yet, for North Koreans, this is the only world they have known. To be born into surveillance is to be born into a cage that does not always look like a cage, because its walls are built not just of barbed wire, but of relationships, habits, and fear. It is a society where the machinery of control is not distant, but intimate, present in the faces of neighbors, the voices of children, the rituals of daily life. Kim Il-sung created the foundation of this system, but his successors strengthened it. Kim Jong-il expanded the secret police and increased surveillance during the famine years, when desperation threatened to destabilize the regime. Kim Jong-un has modernized it, adding new technologies, increasing border security, and ensuring that even as smuggled media leaks in, the state's grip does not loosen. The dynasty's survival depends on surveillance, because only by seeing everything can the regime prevent challenges from forming. Without trust among citizens, unity against the state is impossible. Life under surveillance in North Korea is not only about control, but about transformation. It transforms fear into habit, habit into culture, and culture into identity. It creates a people who are both victims and participants, who endure because endurance is the only option. It is the silent architecture of the state, invisible yet ever present, the true foundation of the regime's power. Sex may be fleeting, war may scar a nation, ideology may inspire sacrifice, but surveillance ensures obedience. It is the machinery that turns a divided land into a controlled society, that silences dissent before it can form, that watches over every breath and every word. To understand North Korea is to understand this reality, that life itself is lived under eyes that never close, in a system where surveillance is not only about control, but about survival. To step into North Korea is to step into a landscape shaped not only by mountains and rivers, but by portraits, slogans, and monuments. It is a world where the faces of the Kim family look down from every wall, where songs of devotion echo from loudspeakers, where rituals of loyalty structure every day. The cult of personality in North Korea is not decoration, but the backbone of the regime, a system that transformed a family into symbols, symbols into deities, and deities into rulers beyond question. Propaganda here is not an accessory to politics. It is politics itself, woven into every corner of life until it becomes impossible to tell where belief ends and performance begins. The roots of this cult can be traced back to Kim Il-sung, the founder of the regime. From the early years, his image was carefully cultivated. State media presented him as the great liberator who drove out the Japanese, the genius strategist who resisted the Americans, the father who guided the people with wisdom and care. His biography was rewritten into legend, filled with stories of miraculous victories, childhood courage, and near supernatural foresight. Guerrilla skirmishes in the forests of Manchuria were magnified into epic battles. Speeches became sacred texts, quoted endlessly in classrooms and factories. The man became myth, and the myth became law. The portrait was one of the most powerful tools of this cult. Every home in North Korea is required to display framed images of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, later joined by Kim Jong-un. These portraits are not optional decoration, they are mandatory symbols of loyalty. Inspectors visit homes to ensure they are properly cleaned, dusted, and displayed in places of honor. Citizens must bow before them, and in times of fire or disaster, saving the portraits is often considered more important than saving possessions. Stories circulate of citizens rushing into burning houses to rescue the leader's image, hailed as heroes for their devotion. Through these portraits, the cult of personality enters the most private spaces, turning every living room into a shrine. Slogans reinforce this devotion. Painted in bold red letters on walls, billboards, and factory gates, they proclaim the greatness of the leaders and the eternal power of the revolution. Phrases like "Long live the great leader, Comrade Kim Il-sung," or "Let us defend the headquarters of the revolution with our lives" are not suggestions but commands. These slogans are repeated daily, chanted in rallies, memorized in schools. The repetition ingrains them so deeply that they become background noise, like the air itself. Citizens breathe them in, and over time they become inseparable from thought. The cult of personality works not by argument, but by saturation, surrounding people until devotion feels like the natural state of mind. Rituals are equally important. Every morning, workers and students bow before statues of the leaders. Mass rallies fill city squares, where tens of thousands wave flags in perfect unison, chanting slogans and singing songs of praise. The mass games, elaborate spectacles of synchronized gymnastics and choreography, present the nation as a single body moving under the guidance of one mind, the leaders. These rituals are not occasional but constant, shaping the rhythm of life. Birthdays of the leaders are national holidays, celebrated with parades, performances and fireworks. Even death does not end the rituals. When Kim Il-sung died in 1994 and Kim Jong-il in 2011, the mourning was mandatory and public. Citizens wept in the streets, their grief broadcast to the world. To fail to display enough sorrow was dangerous. In this way, the cult extends beyond life, making leaders eternal figures who continue to command loyalty from beyond the grave. Propaganda saturates every medium. Newspapers, the only ones available, print endless stories of the leaders' wisdom. Radio and television, tightly controlled, broadcast speeches, songs and dramas glorifying the Kim family. Films produced under Kim Jong-il's supervision romanticized revolution, sacrifice, and loyalty. Even art and architecture serve propaganda. Towering monuments, like the Mansudai Grand Monument in Pyongyang, dwarf citizens with the sheer scale of bronze statues depicting the leaders. Murals portray them as benevolent figures surrounded by blooming flowers, glowing suns, or cheering crowds. The goal is not subtle persuasion, but overwhelming presence. The leader is everywhere, larger than life, impossible to escape. Education is perhaps the most powerful weapon of this system. From the first day of school, children are taught not only to read and write, but to memorize the biographies of the leaders. They learn songs praising Kim Il-sung, stories of Kim Jong-il's childhood genius, and now tales of Kim Jong-un's early leadership. Textbooks present the Kim family as saviors, their lives intertwined with the destiny of the nation. Loyalty to the leader is framed as the highest moral duty, more important even than loyalty to family. For generations raised in this system, devotion becomes as natural as breathing. It is not just propaganda, it is identity. The cult of personality is reinforced by fear. To criticize the leader, even in private, is unthinkable. Informants may be listening, and punishment can be swift and brutal. Political prison camps hold those accused of disloyalty, often along with their entire families. Fear ensures that even those who doubt remain silent, performing devotion outwardly. Over time, performance and belief blur. People weep at rallies, not only because they must, but because decades of ritual have made the emotion feel genuine. The line between sincere loyalty and enforced loyalty disappears. That is the genius of propaganda in North Korea. It does not simply impose obedience, it reshapes emotion itself. Unlike other communist states, where leaders were powerful but not deified, North Korea turned the Kim family into figures of worship. Kim Il-sung was declared the eternal president even after his death. Kim Jong-il was immortalized as the dear leader, his wisdom presented as timeless. Kim Jong-un, though younger, is framed as the continuation of this sacred lineage, the respected marshal, carrying forward the destiny of the nation. This hereditary cult is unprecedented in modern politics, blending monarchy, religion, and communism into a unique system where the leader is not just a ruler, but a godlike figure. For ordinary citizens, life inside this cult means constant performance. At work, they recite slogans. At home, they polish portraits. In schools, they sing songs. In public, they attend rallies. Each act alone may seem small, but together they create a life where loyalty is all-encompassing. To live in North Korea is to live inside a theatre of devotion, where the script is written by the state and the actors have no choice but to play their roles. Yet within this performance, people find ways to survive. Some internalize the devotion fully, others treat it as ritual, still others quietly doubt while never showing it. The cult is total, but within its shadows, human complexity remains. The cult of personality is not static, it evolves. Under Kim Il-sung, it was built on liberation and revolution. Under Kim Jong-il, it shifted toward cultural sophistication and nuclear defiance. Under Kim Jong-un, it emphasizes youth, strength, and modernization. Yet the core remains unchanged. The leader is the nation, the family is eternal, and devotion is survival. Each generation of Kim reshapes the cult to fit the moment, but always within the same framework of deification. For outsiders, it is easy to dismiss this system as absurd, to see it only as brainwashing. But for those inside, it is life. To be born in North Korea is to inherit not only a family, but a father leader. To grow up not only with parents, but with portraits. To learn not only history, but myth. Propaganda in North Korea is not simply about persuading people. It is about constructing reality itself, ensuring that the line between truth and fiction disappears. In such a world, devotion is not just demanded, it is unavoidable. The cult of personality ensures the regime's survival in ways that military power alone cannot. Armies can defend borders, but myths defend legitimacy. Tanks can crush dissent, but portraits shape generations. Surveillance ensures obedience, but propaganda creates identity. By turning one family into deified rulers, North Korea built a system where loyalty is not only enforced, but felt, not only required, but internalized. It is a system where politics becomes worship, where history becomes legend, and where rulers become eternal. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may come and go, ideologies may shift, but propaganda and the cult of personality make devotion permanent. They create a world where the leader is always present, where loyalty is always demanded, where the people themselves become actors in a drama that never ends. To understand North Korea, one must understand this. The Kim family is not simply ruling, they are enshrined, immortalized, and woven into the very fabric of the nation. The cult of personality is not propaganda alone. It is the soul of the regime. To speak of daily life in North Korea is to step into a world where ordinary routines are shaped by extraordinary limits. From the outside, people may imagine life defined only by military parades and propaganda posters, but within the borders of the so-called hermit kingdom, daily life is quieter, harsher, and more fragile. It is a life lived under scarcity, where food is never guaranteed, where ration cards dictate survival, where work brigades demand endless labor, and where scarcity itself becomes a way of being. Yet even in such conditions, people endure, adapt, and find ways to continue the rhythms of living. Food is at the center of this story. North Korea has long struggled to feed its people. Mountains cover much of the land, leaving little arable soil, and harsh winters shorten the growing season. Farms are collectivized, and the state controls the harvests, distributing food through the public distribution system. In theory, every citizen receives a ration of rice, corn, or potatoes according to their status and needs. In practice, rations are meager and unreliable. During the best of times, families may scrape by, supplementing with vegetables grown in small gardens. In harder years, rations shrink or vanish altogether, forcing people to forage for grasses, tree bark, or anything edible. Hunger is not an occasional hardship, but a constant shadow. The memory of the 1990s famine, called the Arduous March, still shapes the nation. During those years, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and a series of natural disasters, the food system collapsed. Millions are believed to have starved, entire families lost to hunger. Survivors recall eating weeds, stripping bark from trees, boiling corn husks for soup. That trauma lingers. Even today, in periods of relative stability, the fear of hunger is woven into daily life. Families hide food when they can, share small gardens, or barter secretly in informal markets. To eat one full meal a day is considered good fortune. Food, more than politics or ideology, is the reality that defines ordinary existence. Rationing creates hierarchies. The military receives priority, ensuring soldiers are fed even when civilians go hungry. Elites in Pyongyang may access better supplies, including imported goods, while rural areas face chronic shortages. Workers in heavy industry may receive extra rations, while intellectuals or farmers receive less. In a country that preaches equality, food distribution reflects power. For many citizens, life is a daily negotiation with scarcity, where survival depends not only on official rations, but on personal ingenuity, family connections, and sheer endurance. Work brigades dominate the rhythm of life. From childhood, citizens are organized into groups that labor for the state. Students march to fields to harvest crops, factory workers join brigades to repair roads, women sew uniforms or prepare food for the military. These tasks are not optional. They are framed as patriotic duty. Songs and slogans accompany the labor, transforming exhaustion into ritual. Yet behind the slogans lies fatigue. Long hours of back-breaking work leave little time for rest, and failure to participate can bring suspicion or punishment. Even leisure is shaped by duty, as families are often called to collective projects on weekends or holidays. Work in North Korea is not only about production, it is about loyalty, discipline, and demonstrating devotion to the regime. Scarcity shapes not only food and labor, but every corner of daily life. Electricity is inconsistent, with power cuts common even in Pyongyang. In rural areas, many homes are dark at night, lit only by candles or small fires. Heating in winter is a constant struggle, with families burning wood or coal when available. Clothing is simple, often standardized, with limited variety. Imported goods are rare, and ownership of anything foreign can attract unwanted attention. Transportation is limited, with few private vehicles and unreliable buses or trains. Travel between cities requires permission, and crossing the border is nearly impossible. Daily life is bound not only by scarcity, but by immobility, a life lived within narrow physical and social boundaries. Despite these limits, people adapt. Informal markets called jangmadang have emerged as vital lifelines. Here, citizens buy and sell goods outside official state channels, trading food, clothing, tools, or even smuggled media. These markets operate in a grey zone, tolerated because they prevent collapse, yet officially discouraged as they undermine the state's monopoly. Women often play leading roles in these markets, sustaining their families by bartering and trading. For many, the jangmadang represents resilience, proof that even under constant scarcity, life finds a way. It is in these spaces that whispers of the outside world also enter, through DVDs, radios, or USB drives smuggled across the border. Scarcity also shapes social rituals. Weddings, birthdays, and holidays are celebrated, but often with modest meals or symbolic gestures rather than abundance. Sharing food becomes a profound act of generosity, a way of demonstrating loyalty not only to family, but to friends and neighbors. Communities often pool resources to survive, yet this solidarity coexists with surveillance. A neighbor who shares food today may report a careless word tomorrow. Trust is fragile, but cooperation remains necessary, especially in times of hardship. Daily life under scarcity is also defined by propaganda. Loudspeakers in villages broadcast slogans about endurance, urging citizens to tighten their belts and remain strong. Posters show smiling farmers and workers, their strength portrayed as victory over hardship. Hunger is reframed as noble sacrifice, scarcity as patriotic duty. The state insists that self-reliance, huchi, means surviving without dependence on outsiders. For children, schools teach that devotion to the leader will bring abundance in the future. In this way, the regime transforms suffering into narrative, ensuring that even in deprivation, loyalty is demanded. The psychological toll is heavy. Living under constant scarcity creates not only physical hunger, but emotional exhaustion. Parents worry about feeding children, children grow up with memories of empty stomachs, and communities live with the constant uncertainty of survival. Yet resilience emerges too. Families invent recipes from weeds or wild plants. Children play with makeshift toys, finding joy in scarcity. Songs and laughter still exist, woven into hardship. This resilience is perhaps the most remarkable feature of daily life in North Korea, the capacity of people to endure, adapt, and continue despite the weight of deprivation. For outsiders, it is difficult to imagine life where scarcity is permanent rather than temporary, where hunger is routine rather than crisis. Yet for North Koreans, this is the only world most have ever known. To live in the hermit kingdom is to wake each day to ration cards, to gather in work brigades, to navigate shortages, and to adapt to limits. It is to live in a country where survival is framed as loyalty, where deprivation is turned into ideology, and where even the smallest comforts are treated as precious. The paradox of North Korea is that even in scarcity, there is pride. Citizens are told they are enduring for the sake of independence, resisting foreign pressure, and proving the strength of their nation. For some, this message resonates, turning sacrifice into dignity. For others, it is merely a story repeated to survive. Yet whether believed or performed, it shapes the reality of life. Scarcity is not simply endured. It is narrated, ritualized, and woven into identity. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may redraw borders, dynasties may shape nations, but scarcity defines daily life in North Korea. It is the constant companion, the silent background of every choice, every ritual, every survival. To live in the hermit kingdom is to live with less, to work harder, to endure longer, and to find meaning in sacrifice. It is to inhabit a world where daily life is not measured in abundance, but in endurance, where the extraordinary becomes ordinary, and where scarcity itself becomes the rhythm of existence. North Korea is a country defined not only by ideology, but by its boundaries. To live inside its borders is to inhabit a sealed space, a nation cut off from the wider world by fences, guards, and ideology, as strong as concrete walls. Travel beyond the frontier is forbidden. Entry by foreigners is tightly controlled, and information from outside trickles in only through cracks in the system. The closed borders of North Korea are not simply lines on a map, but instruments of control, shaping the lives of millions who may never leave their homeland and rarely glimpse the world beyond. The division of the Korean peninsula at the end of World War II laid the foundation for this isolation. When the 38th parallel hardened into a permanent boundary after the Korean War, North Korea became a fortress state. The Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, stretches 160 miles across the peninsula, 4 kilometers wide, bristling with barbed wire, minefields, and soldiers. Watchtowers rise along the frontier, binoculars trained across fields where wild animals roam undisturbed. The DMZ is both a symbol and a prison wall, a reminder that the nation's borders are not to be crossed. Families divided by this line have lived for generations without contact, separated by an invisible yet impenetrable barrier. Leaving North Korea without permission is a crime. Citizens cannot simply travel abroad, apply for passports, or cross borders freely. Only a tiny elite, diplomats, trusted workers, athletes, or performers, are allowed to leave, and even then, They are accompanied by minders who monitor their every move. Their families remain behind as hostages of loyalty, ensuring no one defects. For ordinary people, the thought of crossing into China or South Korea is fraught with danger. Patrols guard the rivers, fences line the frontier, and those caught attempting to escape face imprisonment or death. Yet, despite the risks, some still try, slipping across frozen rivers in winter or bribing guards. The fact that such attempts continue shows both the desperation within and the determination to glimpse a wider world. Entering North Korea is equally restricted. Foreigners who visit on guided tours see only carefully curated landscapes, spotless streets in Pyongyang, monuments to the leaders, schools rehearsed for inspection. Every step is chaperoned, every conversation monitored. Visitors are not permitted to wander freely, to explore markets, or to speak openly with citizens. The experience is like watching a play, where actors perform loyalty and guides control the script. For the outside world, North Korea remains one of the most mysterious nations, a place glimpsed only through cracks and staged performances. Information is perhaps the most tightly controlled border of all. Radios in homes are fixed to state frequencies, unable to tune into foreign stations. Television broadcasts only government channels, filled with propaganda praising the Kim family and condemning enemies abroad. Internet access is limited to a privileged few, and even then, it is restricted to a closed domestic network. For most citizens, the outside world is a rumor, a collection of whispers passed from smuggled DVDs, USB drives, or radios hidden in remote villages. South Korean dramas, Hollywood films, and Chinese news sometimes slip across the frontier, carried by smugglers or defectors. Watching such material is dangerous, punishable by imprisonment. Yet despite the risks, these glimpses of the outside world circulate, challenging the regime's monopoly on reality. The isolation is justified by ideology. The philosophy of Juche frames self-reliance as a national virtue, insisting that dependence on outsiders would corrupt the purity of the Korean people. Propaganda paints the outside world as dangerous, decadent, and hostile. South Korea is portrayed as a puppet of American imperialism, the United States as a constant aggressor, Japan as an eternal enemy. Citizens are told that their nation stands alone against global threats, defended only by the wisdom of their leader. In this narrative, closed borders are not chains but shields, protecting the people from infiltration and corruption. For many, raised on this worldview, the outside world is not a place of opportunity, but a place of danger. Yet the closed borders also serve practical purposes for the regime. By controlling movement, the government prevents the spread of dissent. Citizens cannot flee famine or poverty en masse, cannot organize across regions, cannot compare their lives with those of neighbors abroad. Isolation ensures that loyalty to the regime is reinforced by ignorance. A farmer who has never seen prosperity elsewhere may accept scarcity as normal. A student who has never read foreign books may accept propaganda as truth. By sealing the borders, the state controls not only bodies, but minds. Still, cracks appear. Along the northern border with China, rivers freeze in winter, and smugglers slip across carrying goods and media. Informal markets thrive on this trade, selling Chinese rice, South Korean cosmetics, and pirated films. These items, small as they seem, carry enormous symbolic weight. A bar of soap from abroad, a DVD showing life in Seoul, a foreign song, all reveal a world beyond scarcity, a world of abundance and freedom. For those who glimpse it, the regime's narrative weakens. Curiosity grows, doubt creeps in. While the borders remain closed, the flow of ideas cannot be fully stopped. The human cost of closed borders is profound. Families divided since the Korean War rarely, if ever, reunite. Occasional meetings are arranged between relatives from the north and south, staged under heavy surveillance, filled with tears and the knowledge that they may never meet again. Most die without ever seeing their loved ones. Defectors who reach South Korea describe the pain of leaving family behind, knowing they may face punishment for one person's escape. The border is not only a political barrier, but a personal wound, cutting through the lives of millions. The DMZ itself is both prison and paradox. It is the most militarized border in the world, yet it is also a sanctuary for wildlife, where deer, cranes, and rare species thrive in the absence of human presence. The silence of the DMZ hides the noise of history, a reminder that the border is unnatural, imposed by war and maintained by ideology. For North Koreans, however, it is not seen as unnatural but eternal, a boundary that defines their lives as surely as mountains or seas. Isolation also shapes the nation's economy. With limited trade, shortages persist. Technology lags decades behind. Factories produce outdated goods, infrastructure crumbles, and innovation is stifled. Yet the regime presents this isolation as strength, insisting that independence is more valuable than prosperity. Citizens are told that their sacrifices protect the nation from foreign domination, that poverty is proof of purity, that endurance is a form of victory. Scarcity is reframed as resilience, and isolation becomes ideology. For outsiders, the image of North Korea as a closed kingdom creates fascination and fear. Journalists, scholars, and policymakers study satellite images to glimpse what cannot be seen from within. Refugees provide fragments of truth, each story a window into daily life. Yet the full picture remains elusive, hidden behind fences, propaganda, and silence. The closed borders succeed not only in keeping people in, but in keeping the world guessing. For those who live inside, daily life continues under the weight of isolation. Farmers tend fields with tools from another era. Students memorize slogans instead of exploring the internet. Workers labor in factories with little access to global technology. Families share small meals, rationed and supplemented by barter. Yet within these routines, there is resilience. Children still play, neighbors still help each other. Laughter still emerges in quiet moments. Isolation shapes life, but it does not erase humanity. The closed borders of North Korea are more than physical barriers. They are psychological, cultural, and ideological walls. They protect the regime, justify its rule, and shape the identity of its citizens. They separate families, stifle knowledge, and enforce obedience. Yet even the strongest borders cannot fully contain curiosity, resilience, or the human desire for connection. Smuggled songs, whispered stories, and fleeting escapes remind us that isolation is never absolute. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but closed borders define North Korea. They are the walls that turn a country into a cage, the lines that transform ideology into reality, the barriers that separate not only land but lives. To understand the Hermit Kingdom is to understand this. Isolation is not accident, but design, not weakness, but philosophy, not simply a border, but a way of life. The famine that swept through North Korea in the 1990s is remembered inside the country as the arduous march, a phrase chosen to echo the struggles of guerrilla fighters who once endured hunger and hardship while resisting Japanese occupation. In state propaganda, it was framed as another chapter of heroic sacrifice, a temporary trial on the road to triumph. But beneath the slogans and images of smiling workers, the reality was catastrophic. Entire families wasted away, villages emptied, and millions of people starved. It was not only a humanitarian disaster, but a moment that tested the very survival of the regime. The famine revealed the fragility of North Korea's economy, the cruelty of its leadership, and the resilience of its people. The roots of the famine lay in a perfect storm of history, ideology, and disaster. For decades, North Korea's agricultural system had been fragile. Farms were collectivized, with the state controlling both inputs and harvests. Chemical fertilizers, Machinery and fuel were imported from the Soviet Union, which subsidized its socialist ally. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the aid stopped. Suddenly, the North Korean system, built on dependence despite its Juche rhetoric of self-reliance, lost its lifeline. Fuel to power tractors disappeared, spare parts for machinery ran out, and fertilizers that enriched the thin soil were no longer available. Fields that once produced barely enough to feed the population now yielded far less. Nature added another blow. Floods swept through the country in the mid-1990s, submerging fields, washing away crops, and destroying infrastructure. Roads collapsed, bridges were swept away, and grain stores were ruined. The following year, drought struck, compounding the losses. For a country already struggling with shortages, the combination was devastating. Grain production plummeted, and reserves quickly ran out. The state's public distribution system, which had rationed food for decades, collapsed in many areas. Families that once received small but steady allocations of rice or corn now received nothing at all. Hunger spread rapidly. At first, families stretched what they had, mixing corn with grass, bulking out rice with husks or leaves. But as months turned into years, desperation deepened. Survivors recalled boiling tree bark, digging up roots or eating weeds. Some trapped rats or insects, some searched for fish in polluted streams. In the darkest corners of the famine, rumors of cannibalism surfaced, whispers too dangerous to speak openly, but remembered with horror by those who lived through the time. Parents faced the unbearable choice of which child to feed, which family member to save. Train stations filled with the bodies of those who collapsed while searching for food. The human toll is still debated, with estimates ranging from hundreds of thousands to more than 2 million dead. In a country where information is tightly controlled, exact numbers are impossible to confirm. What is certain is that nearly every family suffered loss. For many, the famine was not an event, but a season of death that lasted years, a time when neighbors disappeared, when classrooms emptied, when hunger became the only reality. The regime's response was marked by denial and propaganda. Officially, the famine was framed as the arduous march, a noble struggle against foreign enemies and natural disasters. Citizens were told that sacrifices were temporary, that endurance was patriotic, that suffering proved loyalty. State media showed images of smiling farmers, slogans about resilience, and stories of citizens surviving heroically on little food. But behind the slogans, the leadership prioritized its survival over the lives of its people. Resources were diverted to the military, ensuring the army remained fed even as civilians starved. Grain imports were hoarded for elites, while rural areas received almost nothing. International aid eventually began to flow, but even this was manipulated. The regime accepted food from the United Nations, South Korea, and non-governmental organizations, yet distribution was tightly controlled. Aid workers were restricted from traveling freely, monitored by government minders, and shown only what the state allowed. Many shipments were redirected to soldiers or the black market, enriching those in power while the poorest continued to starve. Yet even this flawed assistance saved lives, preventing complete collapse. As the public distribution system crumbled, survival shifted from the state to the people themselves. Informal markets, or jangmadang, emerged across the country. Families bartered for food, women sold homemade goods, and smuggled products from China began to circulate. These markets were illegal at first, but the state was forced to tolerate them as starvation threatened to overwhelm society. In this way, famine reshaped the economy. The rigid state-controlled system gave way, at least partially, to grassroots survival. For many North Koreans, this was their first experience of informal capitalism, a fragile lifeline that both sustained families and quietly undermined the regime's monopoly on resources. The famine also reshaped society. Children abandoned by starving parents roamed the streets, forming groups of orphans known as kojebi, or flower swallows. These children begged, stole, and scavenged, symbols of a nation in collapse. Entire families disappeared into silence, their absence noted only by empty homes. Communities once bound by loyalty fractured under the weight of survival. Yet even amid this devastation, acts of kindness persisted. Neighbors shared scraps of food, strangers helped orphaned children, and families supported one another when possible. Humanity endured even as hunger devoured bodies. The trauma of the famine left scars that remain to this day. For those who lived through it, memories of hunger are etched into daily habits. People hoard food when they can, eat quickly, or feel anxious when supplies run low. The fear of famine lingers in every household, shaping behavior long after the worst years ended. This trauma also altered the social contract. The regime, once seen as the provider of rations, lost credibility. Citizens realized they could not rely on the state to survive. Instead, they turned to themselves, their families, and the informal markets. The regime survived, but its people learned that survival came from ingenuity, not government benevolence. Kim Jong-il, who had inherited leadership after Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, emerged from the famine years with his power intact, but his legitimacy questioned. He used the crisis to strengthen control, increasing surveillance, tightening borders, and expanding the cult of personality. Propaganda reframed the famine as proof of resilience, celebrating the people's ability to endure without foreign dependence. Yet the regime quietly shifted policy, allowing markets to operate and seeking aid from abroad when necessary. The arduous march became both myth and memory, a story of sacrifice told by the state, and a memory of loss carried by the people. The famine of the 1990s also changed North Korea's place in the world. International organizations gained limited access, providing aid and glimpsing the reality of life inside. Refugees fled across the border into China, carrying stories that exposed the regime's failures. These accounts, published abroad, shattered the image of North Korea as a purely disciplined, self-reliant state. Instead, the world saw a country where millions starved, where children wandered hungry, where survival depended on scraps. The famine revealed North Korea's vulnerability, even as the regime tried to mask it with slogans of endurance. For those who endured the arduous march, the famine was not only a tragedy but a teacher. It revealed the fragility of systems, the resilience of communities, and the cruelty of leadership. It showed that the borders of ideology mean little when hunger gnaws at the body, that survival often comes not from grand speeches, but from small acts of defiance, like trading in a market or foraging in a field. It proved that even in the harshest conditions, people find ways to live. The famine remains a defining chapter of North Korean history. It explains the deep fear of hunger that lingers in the culture, the resilience of informal markets, the suspicion of state promises, and the survival of a regime that prioritized its own security above its people. It is a story of loss, resilience, cruelty, and endurance, woven into the fabric of daily life. To understand North Korea today, one must remember the famine, not only as a past tragedy, but as a living memory that shapes choices, fears, and habits in the present. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but famine marks lives forever. The arduous march was not only a period of hunger, it was a transformation of a society, a redefinition of survival, and a testament to the power of endurance. The regime survived disaster, but the people paid the price. That is the truth of the famine of the 1990s, a tragedy remembered in silence, endured in suffering, and carried in memory across generations. When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, North Korea entered a moment of uncertainty. The great leader had been more than a president or party chairman. He was a figure woven into the very identity of the nation, declared the eternal president, the father of the people, the embodiment of Huch. His death could have fractured the system, but the regime was designed for continuity. Power passed to his son, Kim Jong-il, the dear leader, marking the first hereditary succession in a communist state. The transfer was not seamless, but it was deliberate, cultivated over decades through propaganda and preparation. Kim Jong-il's era would be defined by contrasts: extravagant displays of power amid famine, cinematic fantasies in a starving land, and a relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons that turned a small, impoverished nation into a global threat. Kim Jong-il's ascent was carefully managed. From the 1970s onward, he had been groomed as heir, elevated in the media, and associated with achievements in culture, military affairs, and ideology. His official titles multiplied: head of propaganda, overseer of the armed forces, and eventually leader of the party. When his father died, Kim Jong-il was ready to assume control. Yet unlike his father, whose legitimacy was rooted in guerrilla struggle and revolutionary myth, Kim Jong-il was more enigmatic. His leadership leaned less on personal charisma and more on spectacle, control, and the reinforcement of dynasty. One of the most unusual aspects of Kim Jong-il's rule was his obsession with film. From his youth, he had been fascinated by cinema, collecting thousands of films from around the world, studying Hollywood blockbusters, Japanese thrillers, and South Korean dramas. He believed film was not merely entertainment, but a weapon of propaganda, a tool to shape the imagination of the masses. As head of the propaganda department, he oversaw the production of operas, films, and novels that glorified the Kim family, idealized Juche, and vilified enemies. He insisted that every work of art should serve politics, declaring that cinema was the most powerful medium of ideology. This obsession reached bizarre extremes. In 1978, North Korean agents kidnapped South Korean actress Choi Yoon-hee and her ex-husband, film director Shin Sang-ok. They were brought to Pyongyang, where Kim Jong-il demanded they make films for him. Under his supervision, they produced several works, including a monster movie called Pulgasari, often described as North Korea's version of Godzilla. The kidnappings shocked the world, but they revealed Kim's belief that culture was not secondary. It was central to the survival of his regime. Through film, music, and art, he built a dream world to reinforce loyalty, even as reality outside the theater was defined by hunger and hardship. While cinema reflected Kim Jong-il's personal interests, nuclear weapons reflected his political strategy. In the wake of the famine and economic collapse of the 1990s, North Korea was weak, isolated, and vulnerable. But Kim understood that nuclear weapons could transform weakness into leverage. They would guarantee the regime's survival by deterring foreign intervention, and they would force the world to pay attention to a country otherwise ignored. Under his leadership, North Korea expanded its nuclear program, defying international pressure and agreements. Facilities were hidden in mountains, enriched uranium was developed, and in 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. Though small compared to the arsenals of major powers, it was a seismic moment. The world could no longer dismiss North Korea as irrelevant. Through nuclear ambition, Kim Jong-il turned his impoverished nation into a global player, one whose threats had to be taken seriously. His leadership style was often described as reclusive and eccentric. Rarely seen in public without his signature sunglasses and bouffant hairstyle, Kim Jong-il cultivated a mysterious image. Rumors circulated of lavish lifestyles, private trains, luxury cars, fine wines, and gourmet meals imported from abroad. In a country where millions starved, such extravagance seemed obscene. Yet for the regime, it reinforced the image of the leader as someone beyond ordinary life, a figure elevated above scarcity. Propaganda portrayed him as tireless, working day and night for the people, inspecting farms, guiding soldiers, and offering wisdom. In reality, much of his leadership relied on maintaining the machinery of control built by his father: surveillance, propaganda, and the cult of personality. The famine years tested his rule. As millions suffered, Kim Jong-il tightened his grip, expanding the power of the military and adopting the Songun, or military-first policy. Resources were prioritized for the army, ensuring loyalty and stability even as civilians endured hunger. Soldiers became the backbone of the state, both in defense and in domestic affairs. This militarization allowed Kim to consolidate power, but it deepened the suffering of ordinary people. The image of soldiers well-fed and armed, while farmers and families starved, became a stark symbol of the regime's priorities. Despite famine, isolation, and sanctions, Kim Jong-il maintained a posture of defiance. Negotiations with the United States, South Korea, and other nations waxed and waned, often manipulated to extract aid or concessions. Promises of halting nuclear development were made, then broken. Diplomatic talks alternated with missile tests, creating cycles of tension that ensured North Korea remained on the world's agenda. For Kim, survival was not about compromise, but about leverage, using threats, promises, and unpredictability to extract what he could, while never surrendering the tools of power. Culturally, the cult of personality expanded under Kim Jong-il. While Kim Il-sung remained the eternal president enshrined in memory and monuments, Kim Jong-il was elevated as the dear leader, continuing the dynasty's mythology. Stories of his childhood painted him as a prodigy, born on Mount Paektu under a double rainbow, accompanied by the appearance of a new star in the sky. State media claimed he composed operas as a child, scored multiple holes-in-one the first time he played golf, and wrote hundreds of books. These myths, absurd to outsiders, were not presented as entertainment, but as truth within North Korea. They reinforced the image of a leader with superhuman abilities, destined to guide the nation. His era also reinforced the hereditary nature of the regime. Even as he consolidated his own power, Kim Jong-il began grooming his son, Kim Jong-un, as successor. Just as he had inherited the mantle from his father, he ensured the dynasty would continue. The process was gradual, with hints of Jong-un's role appearing in state media, whispers of his preparation circulating among elites. The dynasty was no longer an experiment, but an institution, cemented into the political and cultural fabric of the country. For ordinary North Koreans, life under Kim Jong-il was marked by contradictions. On one hand, the famine left deep scars, teaching families that survival depended not on the state, but on their own ingenuity. Informal markets expanded, women became central to household survival, and the black market economy grew. On the other hand, propaganda and surveillance intensified, ensuring that loyalty to the regime was never openly questioned. Hunger coexisted with parades, scarcity with slogans, despair with rituals of devotion. It was a time when the regime survived, not because it provided for the people, but because it controlled them so thoroughly that even in starvation, dissent could not organize. Internationally, Kim Jong-il's era cemented North Korea's reputation as a paradox. A small, impoverished state capable of commanding global attention. His nuclear program made him a figure of fascination and fear, his cultural obsessions made him the subject of ridicule, and his cruelty made him a symbol of dictatorship. Yet he survived, outmaneuvering sanctions, defying isolation, and maintaining power until his death in 2011. The dynasty he inherited did not collapse with famine, nor did it crumble under international pressure. Instead, it endured, scarred but intact, preparing for the next chapter under his son. Kim Jong-il's era is remembered as one of hardship and spectacle, famine and fireworks, hunger and nuclear tests. It was a time when cinema shaped propaganda, when nuclear ambition reshaped geopolitics, and when a dynasty rooted in myth proved resilient enough to withstand disaster. For North Koreans, it was a time of suffering, resilience, and adaptation. For the world, it was a reminder that even the most isolated regime could command attention. Even the weakest state could wield power through fear. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, Dynasties may endure for generations, but Kim Jong-il's era showed that survival itself can become power. By blending spectacle with terror, cinema with scarcity, and nuclear weapons with myth, he preserved his family's rule. His time in power was not only an extension of his father's legacy, but a reshaping of it, ensuring that the dynasty would continue into a new century, still defiant, still mysterious, still enduring. The story of North Korea's nuclear weapons program is not just about missiles and warheads, it is about survival. For a small, isolated nation beset by hunger, sanctions, and enemies on all sides, nuclear weapons became the ultimate shield, the guarantee that the regime could not be toppled, the bargaining chip that forced the world to listen. The nuclear gamble was not an afterthought, but a carefully chosen strategy, rooted in history, shaped by fear, and carried forward with relentless determination. The seeds of the program were planted in the 1950s, shortly after the devastation of the Korean War. Pyongyang had witnessed firsthand the destruction that modern weapons could unleash and the overwhelming power of the United States military. North Korea's leaders understood that conventional strength would never be enough. They began to dream of weapons that could deter even the most powerful enemy. With Soviet and later Chinese assistance, North Korea established research institutions, trained scientists, and built the foundation of a program that would slowly, quietly, grow in the shadows. In the decades that followed, nuclear research advanced in secret. A research reactor provided by the Soviets in Yongbyon became the centerpiece of the effort. By the 1980s, evidence mounted that North Korea was not content with peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Plutonium was being extracted, facilities were expanding, and suspicions deepened. International pressure grew, and in 1985, Pyongyang signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, agreeing in principle not to build weapons. But agreements are only as strong as enforcement, and North Korea had already mastered the art of delay, denial, and deception. Inspectors were given limited access, reports were incomplete, and suspicions never disappeared. The collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s accelerated the gamble. With its main sponsor gone, North Korea was suddenly exposed, vulnerable to isolation and pressure. The famine years revealed just how fragile the country was. Kim Jong-il, who had inherited power after his father's death, understood that weakness invited collapse. Nuclear weapons offered a way out. They could deter invasion, force negotiations, and bring foreign aid. The gamble was not simply military, it was political, a way to turn desperation into leverage. The first nuclear crisis erupted in 1993, when North Korea announced its intention to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Tensions escalated until former US President Jimmy Carter traveled to Pyongyang and brokered the agreed framework of 1994. Under this deal, North Korea froze its plutonium program in exchange for aid, fuel, and the promise of light water reactors. For a moment, it seemed the gamble would be contained. But the agreement unraveled in the early 2000s, as both sides accused the other of failing to deliver. Reports surfaced that North Korea was pursuing a secret uranium enrichment program, and the fragile trust collapsed. The gamble was back on. In 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. Though small by global standards, it was a political earthquake. The world had hoped to prevent this moment, but Pyongyang had crossed the threshold. The underground blast at Punggye-ri sent shockwaves far beyond the mountains of North Hamgyong province. Suddenly, the regime had proven it could not be ignored. Sanctions followed, condemnation echoed, but the regime had achieved what it wanted: survival through fear. The gamble intensified. More tests followed in 2009, 2013, 2016, and 2017. Each explosion was stronger, each missile test more sophisticated. Rockets arced into the sky, sometimes splashing into the Sea of Japan, sometimes flying over Japanese territory, sometimes climbing high enough to prove they could reach the continental United States. The world watched nervously as the regime demonstrated new capabilities: miniaturization of warheads, intercontinental ballistic missiles, hydrogen bomb claims. Each step was presented in propaganda as a triumph of Juche, proof that even a small nation could defy giants. Citizens cheered in orchestrated rallies, but behind the spectacle was a clear message: North Korea would never again be vulnerable. The nuclear program became the regime's ultimate shield. For Kim Jong-il, and later Kim Jong-un, it ensured that no foreign power would attempt regime change without risking catastrophe. Iraq had fallen, Libya had collapsed. But North Korea was different. It had nuclear weapons, and that made all the difference. The gamble worked. The world that once ignored or ridiculed North Korea now had to negotiate, sanction, and adjust. Every summit, every crisis, every missile launch reminded the international community that the Hermit Kingdom held a weapon too dangerous to dismiss. Domestically, the nuclear program was also a tool of propaganda. Tests were celebrated as national holidays, scientists hailed as heroes, and missiles paraded through Pyongyang in grand spectacles. The regime portrayed itself as a fortress defended by its own ingenuity, standing tall against hostile imperialists. For citizens enduring shortages, hunger, and hardship, the nuclear program was presented as proof that their sacrifices were worthwhile. While they tightened their belts, the nation was building a shield that no enemy could pierce. Survival was recast as victory, endurance as strength. Yet the gamble came with costs. Sanctions tightened, isolating the country further. Trade diminished, industries withered, and ordinary people bore the burden. But the regime calculated that survival was more important than prosperity. Nuclear weapons brought time, security, and leverage, even if they also brought isolation and suffering. For the leadership, the trade-off was clear. Famine could be endured, sanctions could be survived, but disarmament was unthinkable. International negotiations cycled between hope and collapse. The six-party talks, involving the United States, South Korea, Japan, China, Russia, and North Korea, sought compromise, but each round ended in mistrust. Agreements were made, broken and remade. Food aid was delivered. Inspectors briefly returned, then expelled. The regime mastered brinkmanship, threatening escalation, then offering dialogue, always keeping the world off balance. The gamble was not just in building weapons, but in wielding uncertainty, making every negotiation a performance designed to extract concessions without surrendering the shield. Kim Jong-un inherited this strategy when he assumed power in 2011. He accelerated the program, overseeing rapid advances in missile technology and conducting the country's most powerful nuclear tests. At the same time, he used the arsenal as a stage for diplomacy, meeting world leaders in unprecedented summits. In 2018, images of Kim Jong-un shaking hands with the President of the United States astonished the world. For a moment, it seemed peace might be possible. But the core gamble never changed. North Korea would negotiate, talk, and smile for cameras, but it would not give up its shield. Nuclear weapons were no longer a bargaining chip. They were survival itself. The nuclear gamble also reshaped North Korea's identity. In state media, the nation was no longer portrayed as fragile or poor, but as defiant and strong. Missiles were described as swords of justice, nuclear tests as thunderbolts of independence. Citizens were told they lived in a small but mighty country, feared by enemies, respected by the world. This narrative gave pride to some, even as daily life remained defined by scarcity. Propaganda turned hardship into virtue, insisting that nuclear weapons were proof that their sacrifices had meaning. For the outside world, the nuclear gamble created a paradox. On one hand, North Korea became more isolated, sanctioned, and condemned. On the other, it became more relevant, impossible to ignore, a permanent fixture in global security debates. The world could no longer dismiss North Korea as a starving relic. It was a nuclear power, dangerous and enduring. This paradox was the heart of the gamble. Poverty could be ignored, but nuclear weapons could not. The gamble remains unresolved. North Korea continues to expand its arsenal, refine its missiles, and defy international norms. Talks stall, sanctions tighten, threats escalate, but the regime endures. For North Korea, the gamble has succeeded. The dynasty survives, the state persists, and the shield holds. Yet the cost is borne by the people, who live in scarcity, cut off from the world, told to cheer as rockets rise into the sky. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but nuclear weapons reshape destiny. For North Korea, the nuclear gamble turned fragility into power, isolation into leverage, and survival into defiance. It is the story of how a small state, battered by famine and sanctions, built the ultimate shield, a weapon that ensures the regime's survival even as it deepens its people's suffering. The gamble is not only military, it is existential. To give it up would be to risk everything. To keep it is to live forever behind walls. For decades, the borders of North Korea seemed airtight, sealed not only with barbed wire and armed guards, but with silence. Information flowed in one direction, from the state to its people, carefully curated through newspapers, radios, and television channels that carried nothing but propaganda. For most citizens, the outside world was a vague rumor, painted as dangerous, decadent, and hostile. Yet in the shadows of this closed kingdom, cracks began to appear. Not cracks in the fences or the concrete, but cracks in the information barrier. Through smuggled DVDs, hidden radios, and tiny USB sticks, fragments of the outside world seeped in. These digital intrusions, small in scale but monumental in impact, brought forbidden glimpses of another life, glimpses powerful enough to shift perceptions, spark curiosity, and undermine decades of isolation. The story begins along the northern border, where North Korea meets China across narrow rivers and mountain passes. Here, geography works against the regime. Rivers freeze in winter, shallow enough to wade across, and trade, legal and illegal, has always flowed back and forth. In this borderland, smugglers became the unlikely couriers of another reality. Hidden among shipments of rice, medicine, or cigarettes came small treasures of technology. DVDs of South Korean dramas, pirated Hollywood films, cheap Chinese radios, and later USB sticks packed with songs, movies, and even news clips. To a country where televisions were tuned only to state channels, these contraband items were like windows punched through a wall. South Korean dramas were among the most influential. On smuggled discs, families watched stories of glamorous lives in Seoul, filled with cars, fashion, romance, and abundance. For North Koreans accustomed to ration cards and hunger, the contrast was shocking. They had been told their southern neighbors lived in misery under American occupation, yet the dramas showed bright cities, thriving businesses, and ordinary people enjoying freedoms unimaginable in the north. Viewers marveled at simple details: full refrigerators, paved streets, colorful clothing. These were not scenes of propaganda, but depictions of everyday life, and they undermined decades of lies. For many, it was the first time they realized that their country was not the envy of the world, as propaganda claimed, but a place left behind. Hollywood films carried their own impact. Action movies, comedies, romances, they introduced concepts of individuality, rebellion, and love unconstrained by duty to the state. Even when the plots were fantastical, the glimpses of abundance, the cars, the food, the technology, were undeniable. Children who watched pirated animations discovered characters who solved problems without consulting a great leader, who made choices for themselves, who lived lives filled with possibility. To the regime, these images were dangerous, not because of their political messages, but because of their ordinariness. They showed that another kind of life was possible, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Radios offered another kind of crack. Tuned secretly to foreign broadcasts from South Korea, China, or the BBC, They carried voices that contradicted state narratives. Listeners learned about world events never mentioned in local newspapers. They heard news of famines, sanctions, and global condemnation of the regime. They also heard music, advertisements, and chatter that revealed the normalcy of life elsewhere. Listening was dangerous. Radios were supposed to be fixed so they could only receive state frequencies, but some families modified them, hiding them under blankets, listening only at night when neighbors might not hear. A few minutes of forbidden sound carried the weight of revelation. Later, as technology advanced, USB sticks became the most potent contraband. Small, portable, and easy to conceal, they could hold gigabytes of content, entire seasons of South Korean dramas, music libraries, even electronic books. Passed from hand to hand, sold in hidden corners of markets, or smuggled by traders across the border, they spread faster than DVDs ever could. For young people especially, USB sticks became treasures, offering a private education in a world beyond the hermit kingdom. A teenager who watched a South Korean variety show, a romantic comedy, or even a news program could not help but compare it to the rigid scripts of state propaganda. The state responded with fury, inspections intensified, with random searches of homes and laptops, raids on markets, and punishments for anyone caught with contraband media. Citizens accused of watching South Korean dramas could be fined, imprisoned, or sent to labor camps. Families lived in fear that a neighbor might report them. Yet repression could not fully stop the flow. The allure of forbidden media was too strong, the hunger for knowledge too deep. Smugglers became adept at concealing USB sticks in clothing, food, or machinery. Families developed elaborate routines for watching, windows covered, sound turned low, children trained to keep secrets. Risk became part of the ritual, a reminder of the value of what they were seeing. The impact of these digital cracks went beyond entertainment. They reshaped imagination. A child who saw Seoul's skyline knew that Pyongyang was not the greatest city in the world. A teenager who listened to South Korean pop songs discovered joy in rhythms never broadcast on state radio. A farmer who watched a foreign news report realized that the outside world knew about North Korea's famine, even as their own government denied it. These realizations, small on their own, added up to something profound. They weakened the regime's monopoly on truth. They gave citizens the power to compare, to question, to dream. The state understood the danger. Propaganda painted foreign media as poisonous, designed to corrupt and weaken. Official campaigns warned citizens that South Korean dramas were lies, that Western films were immoral, that foreign songs carried hidden threats. Public executions were sometimes staged for those caught distributing contraband, a brutal reminder of the risks. Yet the very intensity of these punishments revealed the regime's fear. They knew that a single DVD, a single USB stick, could do what no speech or slogan could: show reality. In some cases, the cracks even influenced escape. Defectors who crossed into China or South Korea often said they first began to doubt the regime after watching foreign media. Seeing abundance on screen made them question why their own lives were filled with scarcity. Hearing news of the outside world made them realize the lies they had been told. For some, the spark of curiosity lit by a smuggled DVD eventually became the fire that carried them across the border. For those who remained, the digital crack offered a quiet kind of resistance. Families gathered in secret to watch a drama. Neighbors whispered about a film they had seen. Young people memorized songs they were not supposed to know. These small acts did not overthrow the regime, but they created private spaces of freedom, moments where the state's grip loosened, even if only for an hour. In a society built on control, such moments mattered. The irony is that the cracks were never fully closed. Technology kept advancing, smugglers kept adapting, and demand kept growing. Even today, with harsher surveillance and tighter border controls, foreign media continues to seep in. USB sticks, SD cards, even small radios remain lifelines to another world. Each one carries not only entertainment, but hope. the hope that life could be different, that another future is possible. The digital crack in the wall does not bring revolution overnight. It does not topple statues or dismantle propaganda. But it erodes certainty. It plants doubt. It shows that the regime's version of reality is not the only one. And once doubt exists, loyalty is never the same. The wall still stands, but light seeps through. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but information is transformative. For North Koreans, smuggled DVDs, radios, and USB sticks are not just objects. They are keys, unlocking forbidden glimpses of a wider world. In those glimpses lies both danger and possibility, the quiet proof that even the most sealed society cannot remain entirely closed forever. When Kim Jong-il died in December 2011, North Korea stood at another uncertain crossroads. The nation had already endured famine, sanctions, and decades of isolation. Yet the dynasty remained unbroken. The question was whether the young, largely untested Kim Jong-un, reportedly in his late 20s, could inherit the throne of a regime that demanded both fear and reverence. The world speculated that the dynasty might falter, that the youth of the new leader might weaken the carefully constructed edifice of power. But the gamble that had worked for his father and grandfather worked again. Kim Jong-un consolidated control through purges, pageantry, and propaganda that felt both familiar and strikingly modern. His ascent revealed not only the resilience of the dynasty, but also its ability to adapt. Kim Jong-un was not a stranger to preparation. Though his name and face were largely unknown to the world before 2010, within North Korea his succession had been planned with care. Just as Kim Jong-il had been groomed by Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un had been groomed by his father. Educated partly in Switzerland under a pseudonym, he had glimpsed the outside world, tasting the freedom and abundance of Europe before returning to Pyongyang. Back home, he was introduced to the elite as the brilliant comrade, his image cultivated in secret, while propaganda prepared the ground. When Kim Jong-il's health faltered, his son was promoted rapidly to high positions within the Workers' Party and the military, signaling the next step in the hereditary march of power. Still, the death of Kim Jong-il left a dangerous vacuum. The dynasty's survival depended on convincing the people and the elites that Kim Jong-un was not merely a young man, but a destined leader, chosen by blood, history, and ideology. The state responded with the tools it knew best: spectacle and ritual. Kim Jong-il's funeral was choreographed with immense precision, with images of weeping citizens broadcast worldwide. The message was clear. The nation grieved as one, and the dynasty remained sacred. At the center of the mourning stood Kim Jong-un, portrayed as the natural heir, the son who would carry forward the revolution. Consolidation required more than pageantry. It required fear. In his first years, Kim Jong-un moved ruthlessly against rivals and potential challengers. Generals who had been powerful under his father were demoted, reassigned, or executed. The most dramatic moment came in 2013, when his uncle, Jang Song-thaek, long seen as a regent figure, was arrested in a televised spectacle and executed soon after. The purge shocked the outside world, but inside North Korea it sent an unmistakable signal. Even family members were not untouchable. Loyalty was absolute, and dissent, real or imagined, would be crushed. In later years, high-ranking officials were removed or executed with similar swiftness, some accused of plotting coups, others of corruption or treason. The purges created an atmosphere of fear, but also ensured that the young leader stood unchallenged. Pageantry accompanied these purges. Kim Jong-un embraced spectacle even more than his father, using grand military parades, fireworks displays, and choreographed rallies to reinforce his legitimacy. Citizens filled vast squares in Pyongyang, waving flags in perfect synchronization as missiles rolled past. Kim stood smiling on balconies, his image broadcast to every television in the country. State media presented him as youthful, energetic, and visionary, contrasting him with the aging figures around him. His appearance, rounded face, distinctive haircut, confident stride, became instantly recognizable, a symbol of continuity and renewal. For citizens, the pageantry reinforced the message that the dynasty was not weakening but entering a new era. Propaganda also shifted tone. While Kim Il-sung had been cast as the father of the nation and Kim Jong-il as the cultural genius, Kim Jong-un was portrayed as both modernizer and warrior. He was shown inspecting farms and factories, but also test-launching missiles and guiding soldiers. He was depicted not only as the inheritor of tradition, but as the architect of a new future. State media highlighted his youth, suggesting vitality, and emphasized his military-first policies, reassuring the army that its privileged place remained secure. Yet there were also subtle changes. Photographs of Kim laughing with soldiers, riding amusement park rides, or appearing with his wife, Ri Sol-ju, showed a more human side. These images softened his profile, presenting him as approachable, even relatable, in contrast to the aloofness of his father. Modernized propaganda reflected the influence of Kim's exposure to the outside world. While the regime continued its traditional forms of devotion, portraits, slogans, statues, it also adopted techniques borrowed from global media. High-quality photography, glossy videos, and stylized posters emerged. The cult of personality expanded into digital formats, designed for both domestic audiences and the world outside. The regime seemed to understand that image mattered not only in Pyongyang, but in Washington, Beijing, and Seoul. Kim Jong-un became not only a domestic figure, but an international spectacle, carefully curated to inspire both fear and fascination. The nuclear program provided another platform for consolidation. Within a few years of taking power, Kim Jong-un accelerated weapons testing, culminating in the most powerful nuclear explosions and long-range missile launches the country had ever achieved. These demonstrations served multiple purposes. They strengthened his image at home, proving that he could protect the nation from enemies. They reminded the world that North Korea could not be ignored. And they reinforced the dynasty's narrative that survival required defiance, and that only the Kim family could guarantee it. Internally, Kim also sought to stabilize daily life. While the regime continued to prioritize the military and nuclear program, it tolerated and even quietly encouraged the expansion of informal markets. These jangmadang, once suppressed, became essential to the economy. Families could trade, buy food, and sell goods, often smuggled from China. For many, this shift provided a small measure of relief, allowing them to survive without total dependence on the state. Kim Jong-un framed this tolerance as evidence of modernization, while ensuring that the core structures of surveillance and control remained untouched. It was a delicate balance. Enough market activity to prevent unrest, but not enough to threaten the regime's monopoly on power. The young leader also understood the importance of symbolism. He restored and expanded monuments to his father and grandfather, ensuring the cult of personality remained intact. He visited Mount Paektu, the mythical birthplace of the Korean Revolution, riding a white horse through snow in a carefully staged photo op. The images invoked legends of destiny, tying his rule to sacred history. In speeches, he framed himself as the guardian of Juche, the defender of sovereignty, the embodiment of independence. In this way, he fused continuity with renewal, presenting himself as both heir and innovator. Fear, pageantry, and propaganda worked together to secure his rule. Within a few years, doubts about his youth and inexperience faded. Elites who might have challenged him were silenced. Citizens who might have questioned him were reminded of the consequences, and the world that once mocked him as inexperienced was forced to reckon with him as a formidable, unpredictable leader. The dynasty had survived its third succession, something no communist state had ever achieved. For North Koreans, Kim Jong-un's ascent was both familiar and new. Familiar in the rituals of loyalty, the portraits, the slogans, the parades. New in the images of a leader smiling with his wife, shaking hands with foreign leaders, or striding beside gleaming missiles. Life remained defined by scarcity, surveillance, and control, but the style of leadership had shifted. It was more visual, more theatrical, more global. The cult of personality was not diminished, but reimagined for a new century. For the world, Kim Jong-un's ascent was a reminder of the dynasty's resilience. Analysts had predicted collapse after Kim Il-sung's death, then after the famine, then after Kim Jong-il's passing. Each time, the regime endured. Each time, the Kim family consolidated power. Kim Jong-un's rise showed that the dynasty was not fragile, but adaptive, capable of surviving through fear and spectacle, repression and reinvention. The young leader, who once seemed vulnerable, proved himself ruthless, theatrical and strategic. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations. But Kim Jong-un's ascent demonstrated that pageantry and fear can preserve power even in the harshest conditions. His purges silenced rivals, his parades awed citizens, his propaganda modernized devotion. The wall of control remained unbroken, the dynasty remained intact, and the Hermit Kingdom entered a new era, different in style, the same in substance, bound to the same bloodline that has ruled for 3 generations and counting. To live in North Korea is to live within an invisible web, one spun from fear, loyalty, and survival. It is not a life defined only by the towering monuments in Pyongyang or the spectacle of military parades. It is the daily reality of millions who wake each morning to the knowledge that every action, every word, every silence is measured by the state. In North Korea, fear is not simply an emotion. It is a system. And loyalty is not simply belief. It is survival. The two are woven together so tightly that it becomes impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. From childhood, indoctrination saturates life. Children learn to speak by reciting praise for the leaders. Songs are taught in kindergarten that celebrate Kim Il-sung as the nation's father and Kim Jong-il as the tireless genius who guides their destiny. Later, Kim Jong-un is added to the chorus, framed as the youthful protector of their future. Textbooks tell stories of miraculous feats performed by the dynasty, framing the family not as politicians, but as semi-divine figures. To question these stories is unthinkable, because school is not only education, it is surveillance. Teachers watch carefully, peers are encouraged to report unusual behavior, and loyalty is measured as much as literacy or math. For a child, indoctrination is indistinguishable from life itself. As children grow, loyalty is reinforced through ritual. Every neighborhood holds weekly meetings where citizens must confess mistakes and pledge to improve. Workers stand before their peers to declare shortcomings, often small or invented, and then promise to redouble their devotion to the leader. These sessions are not designed to correct behavior so much as to enforce conformity. By confessing, individuals admit their vulnerability to the group. By listening, the group learns the value of vigilance. Fear of being singled out blends with the desire to prove loyalty, creating a cycle that repeats endlessly. Over time, performance becomes second nature. People smile when expected, applaud with vigor, and chant slogans loudly, because hesitation is dangerous. Fear takes many forms. It is the fear of neighbors who may inform on you, the fear of inspectors who may arrive unannounced, the fear of secret police who may interpret an innocent remark as disloyalty. It is the fear of collective punishment, where not only the accused but their families can be sent to labor camps. In such a system, loyalty becomes the only defense. Citizens bow deeper, cheer louder, and weep more visibly at rallies, not always because they believe, but because they must. The line between genuine emotion and survival strategy disappears. A man who applauds furiously at a parade may do so out of fear, out of habit, or out of true conviction. But to the outside observer, all look the same. The labor camps, known as Kwanliso, loom as a silent threat. Tens of thousands are believed to live and die inside them, enduring forced labor, beatings and starvation. Few who enter ever return. The mere existence of these camps reinforces the logic of fear. Citizens do not need to see them to know they exist. Whispers and rumors are enough. The possibility of disappearing into such a place disciplines entire communities. The knowledge that one person's careless word could condemn an entire family creates an atmosphere where silence and conformity are the safest choices. Loyalty becomes not just political, but existential. Yet fear alone cannot sustain a regime for generations. Loyalty is also cultivated through identity. Citizens are told that they are part of a chosen people, living in a nation besieged by enemies, yet standing tall because of their leader. Propaganda frames loyalty as honor, survival as pride. Even as hardships persist, hunger, shortages, isolation, the message is that these are sacrifices endured for a greater cause. To be loyal is to be noble, to be fearful is to be weak. In this way, indoctrination reframes the burdens of daily life as proof of devotion. Scarcity is not failure, but virtue. Hunger, not misery, but patriotism. The blending of fear and loyalty can be seen in the rituals of devotion. Citizens bow before statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, placing flowers at their feet. They polish the portraits in their homes daily, ensuring they are spotless in case of surprise inspections. On the leaders' birthdays, parades fill the streets, with thousands of citizens marching in perfect synchronization. To outsiders, these rituals may look like pure propaganda. To those inside, they are also shields. Participation proves loyalty, protects families, and eases suspicion. A bow is not just reverence, it is insurance. A tear shed at a memorial is not just grief, it is survival. Over time, this performance of loyalty shapes even private life. Families speak cautiously at home, careful not to let frustration slip into words that children might repeat at school. Friends share laughter but avoid politics. Couples may whisper doubts only in the quietest moments, knowing that even intimacy can be dangerous. Privacy shrinks, and loyalty becomes not just public ritual, but private necessity. People learn to discipline their own thoughts, rehearsing gratitude, suppressing doubt, because fear teaches that even silence has limits. Indoctrination seeps into identity until it is difficult to know what is truly believed and what is simply performed. Yet beneath the surface, survival instincts create quiet resistance. Smuggled media, whispered jokes, hidden radios, all reveal that not everyone accepts the official narrative. Some watch South Korean dramas and realize their neighbors across the border are not suffering but thriving. Some hear foreign broadcasts and discover news that contradicts state propaganda. These cracks do not dissolve fear, but they complicate loyalty. Citizens may still bow, chant, and cheer, but in their hearts they may carry doubt. Even so, survival demands silence. Fear ensures that loyalty, whether genuine or not, remains the visible language of life. The paradox of North Korea is that fear and loyalty are not opposites, but complements. Fear enforces loyalty, and loyalty masks fear. Together, they create a society where individuals endure hardship while maintaining a facade of unity. The state survives not because every citizen believes wholeheartedly, but because every citizen must act as though they do. The distinction between sincerity and performance is irrelevant when both protect survival. What matters is the appearance of loyalty, and appearances in North Korea are everything. Generational memory reinforces this cycle. Those who lived through the famine of the 1990s know the cost of disobedience. Those who endured the Korean War know the devastation of invasion. Parents teach their children caution, not as ideology but as survival instinct. Do not speak carelessly. Do not question the leader. Do not trust too easily. These lessons, passed down like family heirlooms, ensure that fear and loyalty are inherited alongside language and culture. For many, loyalty is not only performance for the state, but protection for their children. To obey is to shield the next generation from danger. For the outside world, it is difficult to grasp the depth of this system. To imagine life where every word can be dangerous, where every gesture is calculated, where even tears are measured for sincerity, requires stepping into a reality where survival depends on submission. Yet for North Koreans, this is normal. It is the air they breathe, the rhythm of their lives. Fear and loyalty are not extraordinary. They are ordinary, shaping the way people walk, speak, and even think. Kim Jong-un has reinforced this system with his own style. His purges remind elites of the consequences of disloyalty. His parades remind citizens of the glory of obedience. His propaganda modernizes the cult of personality, blending traditional devotion with glossy images of modernity. Under his rule, fear remains constant, but loyalty is packaged as pride in nuclear achievements, pride in defiance, pride in survival. The blending of fear and loyalty is not static. It evolves with each generation of leadership, adapting to maintain the dynasty's grip. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but fear and loyalty bind North Korea together. They are the twin pillars of survival, the invisible chains that hold society in place. Indoctrination teaches devotion, fear enforces obedience, and survival instincts ensure compliance. Together, they create a system where the people endure, the regime persists, and the boundary between belief and performance dissolves. In North Korea, to be fearful is to be loyal, and to be loyal is to survive. North Korea is a country where the extremes of human existence live side by side, a place where spectacle and suffering coexist in the same breath. On one hand, there are grand parades that dazzle the world with perfect synchronization, stadiums filled with tens of thousands of children flipping colored cards to create vast images of the leader's face, and mass games that showcase unity so precise it looks almost mechanical. On the other hand, there are prison camps hidden in valleys, families torn apart by forced labor, and stories of quiet suffering endured in silence. To understand North Korea is to hold both truths at once, to see the beauty of collective art and the cruelty of collective punishment, to witness a country where contradictions are not accidents, but foundations of rule. The mass games, perhaps the most famous symbol of North Korea's pageantry, embody the side of order, spectacle, and pride. For months, children and adults rehearse tirelessly, training their bodies to move in exact harmony. The Arirang Festival, staged in Pyongyang's May Day Stadium, is a performance of breathtaking scale. Tens of thousands of performers, their movements choreographed with mathematical precision, form living mosaics that shift seamlessly from images of Kim Il-sung to glowing suns, from slogans of devotion to colorful displays of athleticism. Behind them, entire sections of the stadium hold colored cards, flipped in unison to create backdrops of rivers, mountains, and revolutionary heroes. The effect is overwhelming, designed to inspire awe not only among the audience, but within the performers themselves. To participate is to become part of a national body, moving as one under the gaze of the leader. Parades follow the same logic. On national holidays, tanks roll through Pyongyang, missiles are displayed on mobile launchers, and soldiers march in lockstep so precise that their boots strike the pavement in a single sound. Citizens line the streets, waving flags and flowers, chanting slogans of devotion. The leader appears on balconies, smiling and waving, the embodiment of unity. For those who watch, whether inside the country or abroad, the message is clear. North Korea is strong, disciplined, and unwavering. These spectacles are not optional but mandatory, rehearsed for months, perfected to avoid mistakes. They present the nation not as a collection of individuals, but as a seamless collective, bound by loyalty and purpose. But the reality behind the spectacle reveals the other side of the contradiction. While children perform in stadiums, other children labor in fields, sent to work brigades to help with harvests. While soldiers march with precision in Pyongyang, other soldiers guard the perimeters of prison camps where political prisoners endure forced labor from dawn to dusk. These camps, known as Kwanliso, are places of silence and shadows, rarely seen by the outside world but central to the regime's system of control. Entire families may be sent there for the perceived crimes of one member. Life inside is marked by hunger, violence, and endless toil. Mining coal, cutting timber, farming barren land. Few survive long, and fewer still escape. The existence of these camps contradicts the images of unity and happiness displayed in parades, yet both realities exist within the same borders. The contradiction extends to daily life. In Pyongyang, the showcase capital, elites walk streets lit by neon signs, shop at stores stocked with imported goods, and live in apartments with regular electricity. Foreign visitors see clean streets, manicured parks, and children in neatly pressed uniforms. But beyond the capital, in rural villages, families endure power outages that last days, water shortages, and homes with crumbling walls. Fields are worked with hand tools, markets are filled with smuggled goods, and hunger is never far away. The same country that parades intercontinental missiles struggles to provide enough rice for its people. This duality is not hidden, it is managed. The regime thrives on contrasts, using spectacle to obscure suffering, and suffering to justify spectacle. Citizens are told that their sacrifices are noble, that hunger proves their strength, that participation in mass games honors their loyalty. The prison camps, while never acknowledged openly, serve as a silent warning, reminding citizens that obedience ensures inclusion in the collective, while disobedience leads to exclusion and suffering. The contradiction is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The cult of personality bridges the two sides. In parades, Kim Jong-un smiles as missiles roll past, framed as the protector of the nation. In propaganda, he is shown guiding farmers and workers, inspecting factories and providing wisdom. His presence unites the spectacle with the suffering, because both are portrayed as part of his benevolence. Citizens endure hunger because he asks them to, and they perform in parades because he leads them. Even the prison camps are justified through the narrative of loyalty. Those inside are painted as traitors, their suffering proof of the need for vigilance. In this way, contradiction becomes coherence. The outside world often struggles to reconcile these images. How can a nation that spends so much on missiles and parades allow its people to starve? How can children perform flawless gymnastics routines while others collapse from malnutrition? How can the same government that organizes breathtaking festivals also operate brutal prison camps? The answer lies in the priorities of survival. For the regime, spectacle ensures legitimacy, while repression ensures obedience. Both are necessary, and both are maintained, even at the expense of the people. The contradictions shape not only policy, but psychology. For citizens, life is lived between fear and pride, hardship and devotion. A child may spend the morning rehearsing for a mass game, the afternoon tending a family garden to stave off hunger. A worker may cheer at a parade one day, then stand in line for hours the next, hoping for rations. A soldier may march proudly through Pyongyang, then be dispatched to guard a camp filled with prisoners who could be his neighbors. Each person learns to navigate the contradictions, to hold pride and fear simultaneously, to find meaning in the rituals while enduring the realities. Yet even within this system, resilience emerges. Families find joy in small moments, sharing food, telling stories, caring for children. Performers in the mass games may take pride in their skill, even if the show is propaganda. Prisoners in camps form bonds of solidarity that help them endure. Markets in rural areas, though illegal, provide glimpses of autonomy and survival. The contradictions do not erase humanity. They shape it, forcing people to adapt, endure, and find fragments of dignity even in the harshest conditions. For the outside world, these contradictions fuel fascination. The same country that displays choreographed perfection on television also hides camps that defy comprehension. The same regime that boasts of nuclear triumphs presides over an economy that cannot feed its citizens. These extremes make North Korea one of the most studied, debated, and misunderstood nations in the world. Analysts search for coherence, but perhaps the truth is that contradiction itself is the coherence. Spectacle and suffering are two sides of the same coin, both necessary for the dynasty's survival. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but contradictions define North Korea. Mass games and parades dazzle with unity, while prisons and forced labor remind citizens of the cost of disobedience. Together, they create a system where joy and terror, pride and fear, spectacle and silence coexist. To live in North Korea is to live in a country of contradictions, where the brightest displays cast the darkest shadows, and where survival requires navigating both. North Korea is often described as the most secretive country in the world, a place where famine, isolation, and global pressure should have toppled the state long ago, yet the regime endures. To study its history is to encounter paradox after paradox. It is a country that has faced hunger so severe that millions perished, yet its government survived. It is a country sanctioned by nearly every major power, yet it continues to launch missiles and conduct nuclear tests. It is a nation portrayed as fragile, even on the brink of collapse, yet 3 generations of the Kim dynasty have remained in power, unshaken by coups, uprisings, or foreign intervention. The endurance of North Korea is one of the great mysteries of our time, a puzzle that has confounded analysts, historians, and ordinary observers alike. Part of the explanation lies in the nature of control. From the very beginning, the state built a system not only of politics, but of total social engineering. Every citizen belongs to neighborhood watch units, work brigades, and loyalty groups. Every home holds portraits of the leaders. Every school teaches devotion. Every workplace enforces ritual confession. Surveillance is not only vertical, from the top down, but horizontal, among neighbors, and even within families. The result is a society where dissent struggles to breathe. In many places, rebellion grows from private conversations whispered into trust. But in North Korea, even whispers can be fatal. The fear of collective punishment, where an entire family may suffer for one person's disloyalty, ensures that silence is safer than defiance. Control is not just political, but psychological, embedded into the routines of daily life. Another reason for survival is ideology. Juche, the doctrine of self-reliance, may appear hollow to outsiders who see dependence on aid and trade, but inside the country it has provided a powerful narrative. It frames survival amid famine as noble sacrifice, endurance under sanctions as patriotic pride, and isolation as proof of purity. By convincing citizens that hardship is not a sign of failure, but of strength, the state transforms suffering into legitimacy. Even when rations vanish and hunger spreads, propaganda insists that sacrifice is part of defending the nation against foreign enemies. In this way, ideology does not mask hardship. It reinterprets it, giving it meaning that sustains loyalty even when the material world collapses. Geopolitics also explains endurance. North Korea sits in a dangerous but strategic location, bordered by China, Russia, and South Korea, with the United States maintaining a military presence just across the demilitarized zone. None of these powers truly want collapse. China fears refugees flooding across its border and the possibility of US troops stationed directly next to its territory if the North were absorbed into the South. South Korea dreams of reunification, but fears the immense cost of rebuilding and integrating a collapsed North. The United States seeks stability, wary of loose nuclear weapons in the event of regime breakdown. Russia views North Korea as a useful buffer. For all their differences, these powers share one interest: preventing chaos. In this way, global pressure often stops short of collapse, leaving the regime room to survive. The nuclear program has further ensured endurance. By developing weapons of mass destruction, North Korea created the ultimate deterrent. No foreign power can risk invasion or regime change without considering the catastrophic consequences of retaliation. Nuclear weapons guarantee that the regime cannot be ignored, turning weakness into strength, poverty into leverage. They also provide domestic legitimacy, portrayed as symbols of pride and defiance. For citizens, the missiles displayed in parades are not just weapons. They are proof that their sacrifices keep the nation strong. Nuclear ambition has made endurance possible, anchoring the dynasty with the shield of fear. Markets, once suppressed, have also helped. After the famine of the 1990s, informal markets, jangmadang, spread across the country. These markets, though technically illegal, became tolerated because they were essential to survival. Families traded food, clothing, and smuggled goods, building fragile networks of resilience. Women in particular became central to this underground economy, sustaining households while men remained tied to state jobs. These markets weakened the state's control over resources, but paradoxically strengthened its survival by preventing total collapse. By allowing just enough autonomy, the regime kept society alive while maintaining political dominance. Survival was outsourced to the people, while loyalty was still demanded by the state. Cultural control has also endured, even as cracks appeared. The smuggling of DVDs, USB sticks, and radios has shown citizens glimpses of the outside world, but propaganda still dominates public life. The regime has been able to absorb these cracks without shattering. Some citizens may secretly doubt the official narrative, but they continue to bow before portraits, attend rallies, and perform loyalty. In a society where performance and survival are indistinguishable, the appearance of unity remains intact, even if belief wavers. The dynasty endures not because every citizen believes, but because every citizen must act as if they do. The dynasty itself is central to endurance. Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un have each reshaped the system to fit their time while maintaining continuity. The myth of sacred blood ties the past to the present, making succession appear inevitable, almost divine. The cult of personality ensures that loyalty is not to an abstract state or party, but to a living person, a face that citizens see on posters, statues, and television screens. This personalization of power creates stability. While other authoritarian states fracture when leaders die, North Korea has maintained continuity through heredity. The dynasty itself is the glue that holds the system together. Yet for all these explanations, mystery remains. Why do ordinary citizens continue to endure, decade after decade, in conditions that would spark rebellion elsewhere? Why does the system not fracture under the weight of famine, sanctions, and isolation? Part of the answer may be resilience. North Koreans have adapted to scarcity with extraordinary ingenuity, finding ways to survive through markets, foraging, and quiet cooperation. They have learned to endure fear by turning loyalty into habit, to live within contradiction by compartmentalizing belief and performance. The resilience of the people is as important to the survival of the regime as the power of the state. The future of North Korea remains uncertain, and this uncertainty deepens the mystery. Will the dynasty continue unbroken into a fourth generation? Will markets erode the state's monopoly on resources until loyalty cannot be sustained? Will smuggled media expand cracks in the information wall until the facade collapses? Or will the nuclear shield ensure the regime endures for decades more, frozen in defiance while the world watches? Analysts debate endlessly, but prediction has always failed. Each time collapse seemed imminent, endurance followed. Each time weakness seemed overwhelming, the regime found a way to survive. For the outside world, North Korea is both a threat and a fascination. Its endurance defies expectations, its secrecy fuels speculation, and its contradictions captivate imaginations. For its citizens, it is simply life, a life shaped by fear, loyalty, scarcity, and pride. A life where endurance is not choice, but necessity. The mystery remains not only why the state endures, but how the people themselves find ways to continue within it. Sex may feel fleeting, wars may scar nations, dynasties may endure for generations, but North Korea's survival defies easy explanation. It is a country where famine has not toppled leadership, where isolation has not broken identity, where pressure has not shattered control. The mystery that remains is not only about politics, but about humanity, the capacity of people to adapt, to endure, and to live within contradictions that outsiders can scarcely imagine. That mystery endures, just as the regime does, leaving questions about the future that no one, not even those within its borders, can fully answer.